Forget the spacecraft, forget the fuel. The real problem with interstellar travel is something far more unsettling, and it's staring back at you every time you look in a mirror, because the universe doesn't just push back against our engines, it pushes back against us, against what our bodies can handle. And more importantly, would the person who arrives still be you? If you are someone who genuinely loves having your mind blown by the cosmos, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now let's get started. Even if you have a ship that can move at 20% the speed of light, and you've somehow shielded it from the interstellar medium, and you've got artificial gravity, you still have a human being inside that ship. And that human being is the most fragile, most beautifully complicated piece of technology on board. Here's what happens when you remove a human being from everything their body evolved alongside. First, gravity. Earth's gravitational pull is 9.8 meters per second squared. Every muscle, every bone, every vein and artery in your body was built around that number. It's not a preference, it's a structural requirement. Astronauts on the International Space Station who do rigorous exercise for 2 hours every single day specifically to counteract this, still lose significant bone density and muscle mass over the course of a 6-month mission. The cardiovascular system, no longer fighting gravity to push blood upward toward the brain, begins to restructure itself. Fluid shifts toward the head, the optic nerve swells, vision deteriorates. A condition called spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, SANS, has been observed in a significant number of long-duration astronauts, and researchers are still working to fully understand why it happens and how to stop it. Now imagine not 6 months, not a year, imagine generations. Because some proposed interstellar mission designs, the generational ship concept, involve crews who would be born, live their entire lives, and die aboard the vessel, with their children's children eventually arriving at the destination. What does a human being look like after 4 or 5 generations of low gravity? What does their skeleton look like? Their cardiovascular system? Their eyes? We genuinely don't know, and that uncertainty is not a small thing. That is one of the most profound open questions in the science of human space exploration. But gravity is just the beginning. The second force working against you, silently, invisibly, relentlessly, is cosmic radiation. On Earth, you are protected by 2 things: the planet's magnetic field, which deflects charged particles from the sun and beyond, and the atmosphere, roughly 10 tons of air per square meter sitting above your head at all times, absorbing radiation before it reaches you. Out in deep space, beyond the heliosphere, the bubble of solar wind that our sun projects outward, stretching to about 120 astronomical units, there is no magnetic field protecting you. There is no atmosphere. There is nothing between you and the full, unfiltered fury of galactic cosmic rays. These are not the radiation you think of when you think of a dental X-ray. These are high-energy particles, protons, helium nuclei, heavier atomic nuclei, traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, launched by supernovae and other violent events across the galaxy. When they pass through living tissue, they don't just ionize cells, they shatter DNA strands. They can pass through standard shielding materials and produce secondary radiation in the process, sometimes making the shielding itself a source of additional exposure. NASA has identified cosmic radiation as one of the top 3 risks to human health on a Mars mission, and Mars is, in cosmic terms, practically next door. You were built for Earth. 3.8 billion years of evolution went into making you perfectly suited for this world. And the moment you leave it, truly leave it, not just skim its upper atmosphere, your body begins to respond in ways that are fascinating, deeply concerning, and in some cases irreversible. We've covered gravity, we've covered radiation, we've just scratched the surface. Because here's what I haven't told you yet, and this might be the most unsettling part of all of this. The biological challenges of interstellar travel are almost manageable compared to what the psychological journey does to a person. And not just to one person, to a crew, to a community, to a civilization in miniature, sealed inside a metal tube, with no way back, no horizon to look toward, no stars that look familiar anymore. What happens to the human mind when it loses its connection to everything it has ever known? That's what we will explore, and I promise you, it goes places you did not expect. Let's talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention in the conversation about interstellar travel. Something that doesn't show up in engineering diagrams or fuel calculations or spacecraft blueprints. Something invisible, unmeasurable in the traditional sense, and yet arguably the most decisive factor in whether a long-duration space mission succeeds or catastrophically falls apart: the human mind. Not the human brain as a biological organ, though we'll get there, because what deep space does to the brain physically is its own kind of horror story. No, right now I want to talk about the mind, the part of you that needs meaning, the part that needs connection, the part that needs to feel, on some fundamental level, that what you are doing matters, and that the people around you are allies rather than threats, because here is something that researchers in space psychology, yes, that is a real and growing field, have found consistently across decades of studying isolated, confined environments. Humans are extraordinarily bad at being alone together. Let me explain what I mean by that. When you put a small group of people in a confined space for an extended period of time, something predictable happens. Not immediately, usually not in the first few weeks, when everything is novel and exciting, and the mission feels electric with purpose. But slowly, quietly, the psychological landscape shifts. Small irritations that would be forgettable in a normal social environment, the way someone chews their food, the particular tone they use when they're stressed, the way they leave a shared space slightly messier than they found it, begin to accumulate. Without the release valve of being able to simply leave, without the ability to take a walk and clear your head and come back when you're ready, these small frictions compound into something far more serious. Researchers call it the third quarter phenomenon. In long-duration isolated missions, whether in Antarctic research stations, submarine deployments, or space station rotations, there tends to be a marked dip in morale, group cohesion, and psychological well-being around the three-quarter mark of the mission. People become irritable, withdrawn, sometimes hostile, sleep deteriorates, motivation drops, and this is in missions measured in months, with regular communication from Earth, with the knowledge that home is waiting. Now scale that to years, decades, generations. The longest continuous human spaceflight record belongs to Russian cosmonaut Oleg Kononenko, who as of early 2024 had spent more than 1,000 days in space across multiple missions. Over 1,000 days. And even with all of the psychological support, the regular video calls with family, the carefully structured schedules designed by teams of behavioral scientists, the psychological toll is real, documented, and taken extremely seriously by every space agency on the planet. On an interstellar mission, those support systems largely disappear. Here's why, and this is a physics problem that bleeds directly into a psychology problem. Communication delay. Right now, sending a signal to Mars takes anywhere from 3 to 22 minutes one way, depending on where the two planets are in their orbits. That means a conversation with someone on Mars is not a conversation at all. It's an exchange of recorded messages, separated by gaps of 6 to 44 minutes between question and answer. That alone is psychologically taxing. Astronauts and mission planners have already flagged this as a serious concern for future Mars missions. But on a journey to Proxima Centauri, 4.2 light-years away, a signal sent from the ship would take 4.2 years to reach Earth. and Earth's response would take another 4.2 years to come back, an 8.4-year round trip for a single exchange of information. Think about that for a moment. You ask a question. Your children will be several years older by the time you hear the answer, and by the time anything you said reaches home, the people you were talking to will have lived a significant portion of their lives since you hit send. At some point, and this is not a metaphor, this is a measurable psychological threshold, Earth stops being home and becomes something more like a mythology, a story, a place your grandparents came from, something you know intellectually but can no longer feel. And that severance, that loss of felt connection to the origin point, is something human psychology has never had to process before in the history of our species. Every migration in human history, no matter how vast, maintained some thread of connection. Even the most isolated prehistoric populations, separated by oceans and mountain ranges and deserts, were still on the same planet, still under the same stars, still breathing the same kind of air, still feeling the same gravitational pull, still oriented by the same sun. The disconnection of interstellar travel is categorically different from anything our ancestors ever faced. It is not just geographic separation. It is a fundamental severing from the context in which human psychology evolved. Think about what grounds you, what gives you a sense of continuity, of belonging, of identity. For most of human history, those anchors have been physical, the smell of rain on soil, the particular quality of light at a certain time of day, the sound of a language, a piece of music, a voice you've known your whole life, the visual horizon, that line where earth meets sky that every human being who has ever lived has been able to look toward. On an interstellar ship, none of those anchors exist in their original form. They can be simulated, they can be recreated with extraordinary fidelity using technology we're already beginning to develop, but simulation is not the same as reality. And the human nervous system, built over billions of years to detect authenticity, knows the difference. There is a concept in psychology called solastalgia. It was coined by the philosopher Glenn Albrecht in 2003, and it refers to the distress caused by environmental change in one's home environment. It's the grief you feel when a landscape you love is altered, when the place that shaped you no longer looks or feels the way it did. People living through deforestation, desertification, or the flooding of coastal communities they grew up in report this feeling acutely, a kind of homesickness for a home that still technically exists but has become unrecognizable. Now imagine a version of solastalgia where the entire planet you evolved on is not just changed but gone, not destroyed, just so far away that it might as well not exist. A pale blue dot so distant it isn't even visible as a separate point of light anymore. Carl Sagan's famous photograph, taken by Voyager 1 in 1990, showed Earth as a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam from a distance of roughly 6 billion kilometers. That image has moved people to tears for over 3 decades. It has reshaped the way entire generations think about our place in the universe. But Voyager 1 was only 6 billion kilometers away. Proxima Centauri is roughly 40 trillion kilometers away. From that distance, the Sun itself, let alone the Earth, would be invisible to the naked eye. Our entire solar system would be indistinguishable from the surrounding stars. You would not be able to look out the window and find home. And here is where the psychological challenge becomes something almost philosophical, because at some point during an interstellar journey, a question arises that no human being has ever had to answer in an experiential, lived sense. A question that our entire history, our entire mythology, our entire architecture of meaning has been built around avoiding. What are we if we are not from somewhere? Every culture on Earth is rooted in a place. Every religion, every origin story, every concept of identity ties humanity to this world. We are Earthlings. We are terrestrial beings. That is not just a biological fact, it is the deepest layer of our psychological identity. Strip it away, and you don't just have a person far from home. You have a person confronting an existential void that human thought has never fully prepared anyone to face. Some researchers believe that the first generation of true interstellar travelers, if they ever exist, will need to be not just physically exceptional and technically brilliant, but psychologically transformed in ways we don't yet fully understand. Not damaged, not diminished, expanded. They will need a relationship with identity and belonging that is fundamentally different from anything the rest of humanity has ever lived. And that raises a question that I find genuinely breathtaking in its scope. Is Homo sapiens, as we exist right now, even the right species for this journey? Because evolution doesn't work on the timescale of mission planning. Natural selection can't be scheduled. But we are living in an era where the line between biological evolution and intentional redesign is beginning to blur in ways that would have seemed like science fiction even 20 years ago. CRISPR gene editing, first demonstrated with precision in human cells around 2012, and advancing at a pace that consistently surprises even the scientists developing it, has opened the door to deliberate modifications of the human genome. We are not talking about science fiction scenarios. We are talking about documented, peer-reviewed, real-world technology that is already being used to treat genetic diseases and is being studied for a vast range of applications. What if some of those applications included preparing the human body and the human mind for the specific demands of interstellar travel? What if you could reduce the body's dependence on the 24-hour circadian rhythm tied to Earth's day-night cycle? What if you could increase radiation resistance at the cellular level? What if you could alter the neurological architecture of stress response, reducing the psychological impact of prolonged isolation and sensory monotony? These are not questions from the distant future. These are questions being asked right now, in laboratories, in academic papers, in conversations at the intersection of astrobiology, genetics, neuroscience, and ethics. And the ethical dimension, the question of whether we should do these things, not just whether we can, is where the conversation gets truly, deeply complicated. Because here is the thing that nobody talks about when they talk about genetically or neurologically modifying humans for space travel. The person who arrives at the destination would not be the same kind of person who left, not just older, not just weathered by the journey, fundamentally, biologically, neurologically different. Perhaps different enough that the word human, in its current biological and philosophical meaning, no longer fully applies. Is that a tragedy, an evolution, a necessary step in the long arc of our species' story? I don't think there's a clean answer to that. And I think the discomfort that question produces in most people, that instinctive resistance, that feeling of something being lost, is itself a deeply important data point. It tells us something about how tightly we hold the concept of what it means to be human and how much we fear losing it, even in the service of something as magnificent as reaching the stars. What we've just walked through is the psychological architecture of the problem, the inner landscape of what interstellar travel demands from the human mind, and the ways our current psychology, brilliant and resilient as it is, may simply not be equipped for the journey as it stands. But here's what I want you to hold on to before we move to part 3, every single one of the challenges we've discussed. The solastalgia, the social friction, the identity crisis of leaving Earth behind, the question of what it means to be human in deep space, every one of them is also an invitation. An invitation to understand ourselves more deeply than we ever have before, because space doesn't create these vulnerabilities, it reveals them. It strips away the comfortable noise of everyday life and shows us the architecture underneath. And what we find there, even when it's unsettling, even when it challenges everything we thought we knew about ourselves, is extraordinary. There is a thought experiment I want you to try. Not a complicated one. Just a simple act of imagination that I think will reframe everything we're about to discuss in a way that no amount of data or scientific explanation can quite match on its own. Close your eyes for a moment. Actually, don't. You're watching a video, but stay with me. Imagine you are born on a ship, not born into a family that boarded a ship, not born into a community that remembers boarding a ship. Born on a ship that has been traveling for so long that the concept of a planet, a real one, solid ground beneath your feet, open sky above your head, wind on your face, is something you have only ever encountered in old recordings, in stories your grandparents told. In a kind of cultural mythology that everyone aboard acknowledges intellectually, but nobody has ever felt. You have never stood on soil. You have never watched a sunset. You have never seen rain. Earth, to you, is not a memory. It is a legend. Now ask yourself, what does that do to a person? What does it do to a community? What does it do to the sense of purpose that holds a multi-generational mission together across centuries? Because this is not a hypothetical edge case in the conversation about interstellar travel. For any mission to even the nearest stars using propulsion technology anywhere close to what we can currently conceive of, generational ships are not just one option among many. For many proposed trajectories, they are the only option, and the human story that unfolds inside one of those ships across generations, across centuries, is something we have never had to think through carefully until now. Let's start with time itself, because I think we massively underestimate how strange our relationship with time already is, even before we send anyone to another star. The human brain is not built to process very large or very small timescales intuitively. We have a cognitive comfort zone, roughly the span of a human lifetime, maybe stretched a little in either direction by history books and family stories, and outside of that zone, our intuitions break down. We say we understand that the dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago, but we don't feel it the way we feel that last Tuesday happened 5 days ago. The numbers are real to us intellectually, emotionally, experientially. They are almost meaningless. This is not a flaw in human intelligence. It's a feature of a brain that evolved to solve problems on the timescale of a human life, in a social environment of a few dozen to a few hundred people, in a geographic range of maybe a few hundred kilometers. Our temporal intuition is exquisitely calibrated for that environment. It is almost comically mismatched for the timescales of interstellar travel. Consider a journey to Proxima Centauri at 1% of the speed of light, which is already enormously faster than anything we've ever built, would take roughly 420 years. 4 centuries. That's longer than the United States has existed as a country. Longer than the entire period from the first European contact with the Americas to the present day. Longer than the gap between Shakespeare writing Hamlet and the moment you're watching this video. And Proxima Centauri is the closest star, the closest one. 4.2 light years away in a galaxy that is 100,000 light years across, in a universe that is 93 billion light years in observable diameter. The numbers are almost obscene in their scale. And the human mind, your mind, my mind, the mind of the most brilliant astrophysicist alive today, cannot genuinely, viscerally process them. We can work with them mathematically. We can plot them on logarithmic scales. But feel them, truly feel them, no, we are not built for that. And on an interstellar mission, that cognitive limitation becomes something with real, practical, devastating consequences. Here's one of the most profound and underappreciated problems of a generational ship mission: motivational continuity. When a mission launches, the founding generation, the people who actually board the ship and leave Earth behind, have something extraordinarily powerful driving them. They have purpose. They have the weight of a historic decision. They have the emotional reality of what they left behind, the friends and family and landscapes and tastes and smells of a world they chose to give up. That sacrifice is enormous, and it generates an equally enormous sense of meaning. They know why they are doing this. They feel it in their bones. Their children, born on the ship, have a more complex relationship with that purpose. They were never given a choice. They did not volunteer for this mission. They were born into it the way any of us are born into the circumstances of our lives, without consent, without context, simply finding ourselves here and having to make sense of it. Some of them will embrace the mission with the same fire as the founders. Some will resent it. Some will grieve a home they never had. And some, and this is the one that keeps mission designers up at night, some will simply stop caring because purpose is not automatically inherited. Meaning doesn't pass through DNA. Each generation has to reconstruct it, reinvent it, choose it for themselves. And when the destination is a star that is still 300 years away, when nothing about your daily life has visibly changed in the direction of progress, when the stars outside the window look the same as they did when your great-great-grandparents were alive, maintaining the original fire of the mission across multiple generations is one of the most complex social engineering challenges our species has ever contemplated. Anthropologists and historians have actually studied this problem through the lens of existing long-duration cultural projects on Earth, and the findings are both illuminating and sobering. Medieval cathedrals are a fascinating case study. The great cathedrals of Europe, Notre Dame de Paris, Cologne Cathedral, Salisbury Cathedral, took generations to build. Notre Dame took roughly 200 years. Cologne Cathedral took over 600 years to complete, begun in 1248 and not finished until 1880. The people who laid the first stones never saw the finished structure. Neither did their children or their grandchildren, and yet the project continued. Generation after generation of builders committed their lives to completing something that had been started by people they never met, for reasons that had been articulated centuries before they were born. How? Why? Because those projects were embedded in a living culture, a religion, a community, a set of shared values and rituals and stories that continuously renewed the meaning of the work. The cathedral wasn't just a building, it was a statement about what the community believed, what they valued, what they thought the universe was about. And that statement was reinforced every single week in ceremonies and sermons and songs in a way that kept it emotionally alive across the centuries. An interstellar mission would need to do something equivalent. It would need a culture, not just a mission statement, not just a set of technical objectives, but a living, breathing, emotionally resonant shared narrative that every generation could find themselves inside of. A story that made the work feel meaningful not just to the person who started it, but to the person who would finish it 400 years later, designing that culture intentionally, deliberately, in advance, with enough flexibility to adapt but enough stability to endure, is arguably the hardest problem on the entire list. Harder than propulsion, harder than shielding, harder than life support, because you can test an engine, you can measure radiation, but you cannot simulate 400 years of human social dynamics in a controlled environment and see how it plays out. And there is another dimension to the time problem that gets almost no attention, and I find it one of the most quietly devastating aspects of the whole scenario. The people who arrive at the destination will not be the descendants of the mission. They will be something the mission produced, but never fully anticipated. They will be shaped by centuries of isolation, by the specific social dynamics of their ship, by whatever culture developed in that closed environment over 400 years. They will have their own customs, their own language drift, their own mythology, their own understanding of what Earth was and what the destination means. And when they arrive, if they arrive, they will look out at an alien star system, possibly with planets capable of supporting life, possibly with environments unlike anything in human experience, and they will have to make decisions, enormous decisions, decisions about whether to land, how to land, what to do when they get there, how to organize a new society on a new world, decisions that will affect not just themselves but every generation that follows them. And they will make those decisions not with fresh eyes and the full context of human civilization behind them, but with whatever knowledge survived 400 years of transmission through an isolated community of a few thousand people in a ship in the dark. Think about how much information is lost in 400 years, even in our connected, documented world. Languages die. Scientific knowledge gets distorted through the telephone game of cultural transmission. Social structures evolve in unpredictable directions. Now remove internet access, remove contact with the broader flow of human civilization, remove everything except what was loaded onto the ship at departure, and what arrives at the destination 4 centuries later might be something that looks human, speaks something resembling a language we'd recognize, and carries the ghost of the original mission in its cultural DNA, but is also profoundly, irrevocably different from anything that departed. This is the point where time stops being a logistical problem and becomes something more like a philosophical one, because what is the mission after 400 years? Who does it belong to? The people who launched it are long dead. Earth has moved on. 400 years of scientific advancement, political change, cultural evolution, possibly contact with the arriving ship's distant radio transmissions, but fundamentally separate. The crew who arrives at Proxima Centauri, or wherever the destination happens to be, are they completing humanity's mission, or have they, through 4 centuries of isolated evolution, become something distinct enough that the mission is now theirs in a way the founders never quite intended? There is a famous philosophical puzzle called the Ship of Theseus. It asks, if you replace every single plank of a ship, one by one, until none of the original material remains, is it still the same ship? Philosophers have argued about this for centuries, and there is no clean consensus. But an interstellar generation ship takes this puzzle and applies it to something far more consequential than a vessel. It applies it to a people, to a culture, to a sense of shared identity and purpose stretched across centuries and light years. And at the far end of that journey, the question of what arrives and whether it is still recognizably us is one of the most profound that our species has ever had reason to ask now. Here is where I want to introduce something that I think genuinely changes the texture of this conversation. Because everything we've discussed so far, the loss of purpose, the generational drift, the philosophical question of identity across centuries, could sound like an argument against the whole enterprise, like a reason to stay home, to keep our ambitions within the solar system where at least the light minutes are manageable and Earth is still a real, visible, felt presence in the sky. But I don't read it that way. And I don't think you should either, because here's what the science of isolated long-duration communities also reveals, alongside all the darkness and difficulty. Human beings are extraordinary at creating meaning in conditions that should by any rational measure produce despair. The cathedral builders of medieval Europe didn't experience their work as a tragedy because they would never see it finished. Many of them experienced it as a profound privilege to be part of something larger than themselves, something that would outlast them, something that connected them to a purpose that transcended any individual lifetime. There are communities today, indigenous cultures, certain religious traditions, certain scientific institutions that operate with what you might call a deep time orientation, a relationship with past and future that extends far beyond the individual lifespan, that situates the present moment within a story much longer than any single generation can witness. And research on these communities consistently shows that this orientation is not a source of grief or existential despair. It is a source of profound psychological stability, of meaning, of resilience. An interstellar civilization, if we ever build one, would need exactly this: a deep time consciousness, a willingness to act for outcomes you will never personally witness, to sacrifice for people you will never meet, to hold the thread of a story that began before you were born and will continue long after you are gone. And here is the stunning thing. Here is the part that I want you to sit with. We already do this. We do it imperfectly, inconsistently, often badly, but we do it. Every time a parent plants a tree they will never sit under, every time a scientist publishes research they hope future generations will build on, every time a teacher invests in a student whose full flowering they will never see, every time a civilization decides to act on climate or biodiversity or the long-term health of its institutions with the needs of future generations in mind, we are already, in small and scattered ways, practicing the psychology of interstellar civilization. We just haven't framed it that way. If you are enjoying this journey, don't forget to subscribe and give this video a like. You'll never miss another moment of cosmic wonder. Let me tell you about a clock, not a fancy clock, not an atomic clock or a quantum oscillator or any piece of precision engineering, just a clock, the kind you might have on your wall at home, ticking away, second by second, steady and reliable and completely indifferent to everything happening around it. Now imagine two of those clocks, identical, synchronized to the same time down to the nanosecond. You keep one, a friend takes the other and boards a spacecraft. The ship accelerates, slowly at first, then faster still, until it is moving at a meaningful fraction of the speed of light. Maybe 50%, maybe 70, maybe 90. Your friend is gone for what feels to them like 5 years. They eat 5 years worth of meals, sleep roughly 1,800 nights, age 5 years, in every biological sense. Then they turn around and come back. And when they step off the ship and you hold your two clocks side by side, theirs and yours, they do not read the same time. Yours has moved further. By how much depends on the speed. At 90% of the speed of light, the difference is staggering. While 5 years passed for your friend aboard the ship, roughly 11.5 years passed for you on Earth. Your friend is 5 years older. You are 11.5 years older. You left at the same moment. You are no longer the same age. This is not science fiction. This is not a thought experiment or a theoretical abstraction dreamed up to make physics textbooks more interesting. This is a measured, verified, experimentally confirmed feature of the universe we actually live in. It is called time dilation, and it is one of the most disorienting discoveries in the entire history of human knowledge. Albert Einstein first described this in 1905 in his special theory of relativity. The core insight, and I want to say this as plainly as possible, because it is genuinely one of the most radical statements ever made about the nature of reality, is that time is not universal. There is no single, shared now that applies to everyone everywhere. Time passes at different rates depending on how fast you are moving relative to something else. The faster you move, the slower time passes for you compared to a stationary observer. This has been confirmed experimentally many times over. In 1971, physicists Joseph Hafele and Richard Keating flew cesium atomic clocks around the world on commercial airplanes and compared them to stationary clocks on the ground. The flying clocks, moving faster, had lost time relative to the ground clocks exactly as relativity predicted. The effect was tiny at airplane speeds, measured in nanoseconds, but it was real, measurable, and precisely matched Einstein's equations, GPS satellites, which orbit Earth at roughly 14,000 kilometers per hour and at an altitude where gravity is slightly weaker, have to correct for both special and general relativistic effects on their onboard clocks every single day. Without those corrections based directly on Einstein's theory, your GPS would drift by roughly 11 kilometers per day. Every navigation system on Earth depends on the reality of time dilation to function accurately. So when we say that time passes differently at high speeds, we are not speaking loosely. We are not being poetic. We are describing a fundamental feature of space-time that has been woven into the technology billions of people use every day without thinking about it. Now, bring that reality aboard an interstellar spacecraft and ask yourself what it actually means for the human beings inside. At speeds approaching a significant fraction of the speed of light, the kinds of speeds that would make interstellar travel within a human lifetime even theoretically possible, time dilation stops being a nanosecond curiosity and becomes something that reshapes the entire structure of a life. Let's take a specific example that physicists have actually calculated: a spacecraft accelerating at 1 g, that's 9.8 meters per second squared, the same as Earth's gravitational pull, which would conveniently provide artificial gravity for the passengers for the first half of a journey to a distant star, then decelerating at the same rate for the second half, would reach speeds extremely close to the speed of light at the midpoint. Under those conditions, the time experienced by the crew, their biological time, their psychological time, the time measured by every clock on the ship, would be dramatically compressed relative to the time passing on Earth. A journey to the center of the Milky Way galaxy, roughly 26,000 light-years away, would take approximately 26,000 years from Earth's perspective. But for the crew aboard the ship, experiencing continuous 1 g acceleration and deceleration, the journey would take roughly 20 years of ship time, 20 years, a human lifetime. The crew members who left Earth would arrive at the galactic center. If they survived everything else we've discussed, still relatively young, but everyone they knew on Earth would have been dead for roughly 26,000 years. Human civilization on Earth, if it still existed at all, would be as different from the civilization the crew left behind as we are, from the people who painted the cave walls at Lascaux 30,000 years ago. There would be no going back, not in any meaningful sense, not to their Earth. Their Earth would be ancient history by the time they even arrived at the destination. And here is where time dilation stops being a physics problem and becomes something almost unbearably personal. Imagine being 25 years old when you board that ship. You are leaving behind your parents, your friends, your entire world. But you know, because the physics is clear, that by the time your journey is even half complete, everyone you ever loved will be gone, not old, not waiting, gone, along with everyone who remembered them, and everyone who remembered them, and so on, across dozens of generations. You are not just leaving Earth, you are leaving your Earth, the specific, irreplaceable, deeply personal version of it that exists in the relationships and memories and shared history that make a human life feel real. All of that ends the moment you reach relativistic speed, not metaphorically, literally. The people you love will age and die at a rate dramatically faster than you, simply because of the speed you're traveling. This is a form of loss that has no precedent in human experience. We have stories about people who outlive everyone they love, figures cursed with immortality in mythology, tales of soldiers returning from wars to find the world changed beyond recognition. But those stories always involve the same flow of time for everyone. The soldier comes back older, the world has moved on, but at least the same years passed for both. Relativistic travel tiers even that shared timeline apart. You and the people you left behind are no longer living in the same story. You have diverged, not just geographically, but temporally. You are moving through time at different speeds, and unlike the distance between you, which is at least a shared symmetrical thing, you are far from them. They are far from you. The time dilation is asymmetric. They age faster, you age slower, and there is no version of the journey where both things are not simultaneously true. Psychologists who study grief and loss have a concept called ambiguous loss, a term developed by researcher Pauline Boss in the 1970s to describe losses that lack the clarity and social recognition of conventional death. The loss of someone to dementia, for instance, where the person is physically present but psychologically absent, or the loss of a loved one who goes missing, where there is no body, no funeral, no defined moment of ending, just an absence that persists unresolved, without the closure that normal grieving processes provide. Relativistic time dilation creates a category of loss that is even stranger than anything Boss was describing. The people you left behind are not dead when you leave. They are alive, going about their lives, thinking about you, perhaps watching the fading signal of your ship's transmissions. But by the time you are a few years into your journey, by the time you have eaten a few thousand meals, slept a few hundred nights, settled into the rhythms of shipboard life, they are gone, and you experienced none of the transitions. No gradual aging, no farewell, no final conversation, just the knowledge, derived from physics rather than experience, that the timeline you shared with them has irrevocably diverged. There is no grief counselor with experience in this. There is no cultural ritual designed for it. There is no framework in any religion, any philosophy, any therapeutic tradition that was built to help a person process this particular kind of loss, because no human being has ever had to process it before. But here is the other side of time dilation, and it is one of the most breathtaking things in all of physics when you really sit with it. From the perspective of the crew, time is passing slowly. Their clocks are running slower. Their biology is aging slower. While centuries or millennia tick by on Earth, they are living through years. This means that, in principle, a human being with a normal biological lifespan could travel to places so remote that the light we see from them today left before our sun even existed. Places that are not just far in space, but, from the perspective of a stationary Earth, almost impossibly far in time. A traveler moving fast enough could, within a single human lifetime of ship time, reach galaxies beyond the Milky Way, could traverse distances that, measured from Earth, represent millions or billions of light years. The universe, from the inside of a relativistic spacecraft, shrinks. It becomes, in a strange and beautiful way, almost traversable, not because the distances get shorter, but because the time required to cover them, from the traveler's perspective, collapses. Carl Sagan wrote about this with characteristic wonder in his book Cosmos. He pointed out that a sufficiently advanced spacecraft, accelerating at 1G continuously, could theoretically reach the Andromeda Galaxy, 2.5 million light-years away, in roughly 29 years of ship time, 29 years. A person who left Earth at 30 could arrive at the nearest major galaxy to our own before their 60th birthday. What they could not do, what the physics absolutely forbids, is go home again and find their world intact. Because while 29 years passed for them, 2.5 million years passed for Earth. Our entire species has only existed for roughly 300,000 years. 2.5 million years is long enough for the entire human story to play out 8 times over. And so time dilation gives with one hand and takes with the other in a way that feels almost deliberately cruel. It makes the universe traversable for the individual. It makes it utterly, permanently inaccessible for the civilization that produced that individual. You can go almost anywhere, but you can never bring what you find back to the people who sent you. By the time you could return, if you returned at all, they would be as distant from you in time as the ancient stars are from us today. This, I think, is one of the deepest reasons why interstellar travel gets more terrifying the further you go. Not because the distances get larger, though they do, incomprehensibly so. Not because the radiation gets more intense or the isolation more profound, though both of those are true as well, but because the further you go, the more completely and irrevocably you leave behind not just the planet that made you, but the time that made you, the era. The moment in cosmic history that shaped everything about who you are. At some point, a traveler moving fast enough is not just exploring space. They are, in a very real sense, exploring time, moving through eras of the universe the way we move through countries on Earth, arriving as a stranger, unable to call home, unable to explain where they came from in terms that anyone around them could understand, alone in a way that no word in any human language was ever built to describe. But here is the question I want to leave you with before we move forward, and it's a question I genuinely don't think has a clear answer yet, because it sits at the intersection of physics, psychology, philosophy, and something that might just be the defining moral question of our species' future. If time dilation makes interstellar travel achievable for an individual but impossible for a civilization, if the person who goes cannot bring back what they find, then what is the purpose of going? Is it exploration for its own sake? Is the act of witnessing enough, even if the witness can never truly share what they've seen with anyone connected to the world that produced them? Is there a version of meaning that survives complete temporal severance from everything and everyone that gave rise to you? I think there is. I think the human capacity for wonder, that deep, persistent, almost irrational drive to know what is over the next horizon, is itself the answer. Not a logical argument, not a cost-benefit calculation, just the same impulse that drove the first humans out of Africa, across land bridges, onto rafts, into uncharted oceans, the same impulse that put the first telescope to the sky and the first boot print on the moon. We go because we go, because the question is there, and we are the kind of creature that cannot leave a question unanswered. But now we're going to confront something that might finally give even that impulse pause, because we've talked about what the journey does to the mind and to time. We haven't yet talked about what the destination itself might do to both, and why the moment of arrival, the moment that every generation ship and every relativistic traveler has oriented their entire existence toward, might be the most psychologically devastating moment of the entire journey. What happens when you get there and it is nothing like you imagined? What happens when the destination is not a haven, not a paradise, not even a recognizable environment, but something so alien, so indifferent, so utterly outside the frame of human reference that the mind simply doesn't know how to process it? That question has a name in psychology, and the answer is more unsettling than almost anything else we've discussed. There is a word that gets used a lot in adventure stories, a word that carries a kind of warm, triumphant energy, the feeling of a journey completed, a goal achieved, a horizon finally reached. The word is arrival. And in almost every story ever told about exploration, arrival is the good part, arrival is the reward. Arrival is when the music swells and the camera pulls back and the audience exhales because the hard part is over. But I want to challenge that framing, because in the context of interstellar travel, arrival might not be the relief at the end of the ordeal. It might be the beginning of the deepest psychological crisis the journey produces. And the reason for that is something so fundamental to human cognition that it operates below the level of conscious thought, shaping everything from how you read a face to how you interpret the sound of footsteps in a dark hallway. It is the reason your brain can walk into a room and instantly, automatically, without any deliberate effort, construct a complete working model of that room, its dimensions, its exits, its potential threats, its navigable surfaces, in a fraction of a second. It is the reason you can step outside and immediately know, without thinking about it, which direction is up. It is called predictive coding, and in deep space at a destination no human eye has ever seen up close, it breaks down in ways that are both fascinating and genuinely frightening. Here is how predictive coding works, stated as simply as possible. Your brain does not passively receive information from the world. It does not sit there like a camera, waiting for reality to walk into frame and then dutifully record it. Instead, your brain is constantly, actively predicting what it expects to encounter, based on past experience, on memory, on the deep evolutionary inheritance of millions of years of navigating Earth-like environments, and then comparing those predictions against the actual sensory input it receives. When the prediction matches reality, your brain barely registers the input. It's expected, it's normal, move on. When the prediction doesn't match reality, that mismatch triggers a signal, something like an alarm, that draws attention, updates the model, and tries to figure out what went wrong. This is extraordinarily efficient for navigating the kind of environment your ancestors evolved in. A rustle in the grass that doesn't match the expected sound of wind gets flagged immediately because it might be a predator. A face that doesn't quite match the expected expressions of the people you know gets noticed instantly because it might signal threat or deception. Your brain is a prediction machine, and it is very, very good at predicting Earth. It has had 3.8 billion years of practice. Now land on a planet orbiting another star. A planet that may have liquid water, may have an atmosphere, may have temperatures within a survivable range, but was not shaped by the same evolutionary pressures, the same geological history, the same particular arrangement of elements and energies that produced Earth. A planet where the sky might be a different color, orange perhaps, or deep violet, depending on the spectral class of its star, where the gravity might be slightly stronger or weaker, changing the way every muscle in your body responds to movement, where the quality of light is different in ways that are subtle but pervasive, shifting the color of everything you see in ways that no amount of intellectual preparation can fully inoculate you against, where the sounds, if there are sounds, if there is an atmosphere thick enough to carry them, are wrong in ways you cannot immediately identify but cannot stop noticing. Your brain's prediction engine, finely tuned over billions of years for one specific planet, would be misfiring constantly. Every sensory input would be slightly, persistently, maddeningly off. Not dramatically wrong, not so wrong that you couldn't function, just wrong enough that your nervous system never fully relaxes, never fully accepts the environment as safe, never lets its guard down, because the guard was built for a world that no longer surrounds you, and it doesn't know how to stand down for anything else. Psychologists have a name for the distress that comes from being in an environment that fundamentally doesn't match your internal model of how the world should be. Several names, actually, depending on the specific manifestation. Culture shock is the mild, familiar version, the disorientation of arriving in a foreign country where the social codes, the visual landscape, the sounds and smells and rhythms of daily life are different from what you grew up with. Most people who travel internationally experience some version of this, and for most people it passes within days or weeks as the brain updates its predictions to match the new environment. But culture shock is a gentle cousin of what we're actually talking about here, because culture shock happens between human cultures, environments that, however different they may feel on the surface, share the same fundamental physical substrate, the same gravity, the same quality of sunlight, the same atmosphere, the same basic biological rhythms shared by all life on Earth. The prediction engine has to update its social and cultural models, but its deep physical models, the ones that tell it which way is down, how long a step should take, what breathable air feels like, what a safe temperature is, those remain intact on an alien world. Those deep physical models are the ones that misfire, and there is a threshold, studied in the context of sensory processing disorders, extreme environmental stress, and certain neurological conditions, beyond which the brain's mismatch detection system stops producing useful alarm signals and starts producing something more like noise, constant, low-level, exhausting noise. A nervous system that cannot relax because it cannot find a single sensory input that matches its predictions closely enough to file as safe. The clinical term for the extreme end of this spectrum is perceptual disintegration. And while it has never been studied in the context of alien planetary environments, for obvious reasons, the neuroscience suggests that a sufficiently unfamiliar environment, encountered after a sufficiently long period of sensory deprivation and psychological stress, could push a human nervous system into genuinely dangerous territory. But let's step back from the clinical for a moment, because I think there is an emotional truth here that the technical language tends to obscure. Think about what arrival at another star system would actually feel like from the inside. After years or decades or generations of travel, of living in the controlled, predictable, deeply familiar environment of a spacecraft, where every surface, every sound, every smell, every social interaction has been thoroughly mapped and internalized, you finally decelerate into orbit around something new, something nobody has ever seen from close range, something that has existed for billions of years in complete indifference to human existence. The first images would be extraordinary, the first data streams breathtaking, the scientific value incalculable. All of that is real and true and worth celebrating, but underneath the wonder, underneath the historic magnitude of the moment, there would be something else. Something quieter and harder to name. A feeling that the universe, which you have spent years or generations traveling toward, does not know you are there, does not care, is not arranged in any way that reflects your presence, your journey, your sacrifice, your hope. The stars would still be scattered randomly across the sky. The planet below, if there is one, would still be turning on its own axis, governed by its own physics, shaped by its own history, utterly unaffected by the fact that human beings have just arrived to look at it for the first time. There is a word for the feeling this produces, coined relatively recently, but describing something ancient and universal in human experience. The word is apophenia, and its opposite, which is what we're actually after here, is the feeling of randomness, of a universe that generates no patterns pointing toward you, a cosmos of pure indifference. Blaise Pascal, the 17th century mathematician and philosopher, wrote something that has haunted me since I first read it. He said, "The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me." He wrote that looking up at the night sky from Earth, from his home, from the world that made him, imagine feeling that silence not as a distant, abstract thing, but as the literal atmosphere of the world beneath your ship. Infinite spaces that are no longer metaphorical, that you have actually arrived inside of. Now here is something that I find genuinely profound, and I want to make sure we don't lose it in the weight of everything else. The fear of arrival, the psychological exposure that comes from actually reaching the destination, is not a reason to stay home. It is, I would argue, one of the most powerful reasons to go, because that fear, that encounter with genuine cosmic indifference, is also an encounter with something that very few human beings in the history of our species have ever had access to. A completely unmediated experience of the universe as it actually is, rather than as our evolutionary programming tells us it should be. Every framework humans have ever built for understanding our place in the universe Every religion, every philosophy, every cosmology from every culture in every era was built from Earth, built from inside the warm, familiar, life-saturated bubble of our home world, built by minds that had never truly left, never truly seen the universe from outside the context that shaped them. The first humans to arrive at another star system would see it from outside that context, and whatever they built to make sense of that experience, whatever new frameworks of meaning, whatever new understanding of their place in the cosmos they constructed in response to what they found, would be the first truly universal human perspective. The first philosophy built not from the inside of a cradle, but from the open, unfiltered expanse of the cosmos itself. That is not a small thing. That might be the most important thing our species ever produces. And there is another dimension to arrival that deserves its own careful attention, because it is the one that carries perhaps the greatest ethical weight of anything we've discussed. What if we are not alone? This is not a frivolous question. It is not science fiction speculation dressed up in academic language. It is a question that some of the most serious scientists alive today consider one of the most pressing in all of human knowledge. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, has been an active scientific endeavor for decades, using radio telescopes and now optical systems to scan the sky for signals that could only have been produced by technological civilizations. The Breakthrough Listen initiative, launched in 2015 with funding from the late Russian billionaire Yuri Milner and backed by scientists including the late Stephen Hawking, is the most comprehensive SETI program ever undertaken, scanning the nearest million stars and the centers of 100 nearby galaxies for signs of technological activity. So far, silence. Or something close to it. There have been intriguing signals over the decades, the most famous being the WOW signal, detected in 1977 by astronomer Jerry Eman at the Big Ear Radio Telescope in Ohio, a narrowband signal so striking that Eman circled it on the printout and wrote "WOW" in the margin. It has never been detected again, and its origin remains officially unexplained. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the sheer scale of the universe, hundreds of billions of galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars, many of them with planets, many of those planets in habitable zones, across a timeline of 13.8 billion years, makes the probability of Earth being the only place where life ever arose seem, to many scientists, almost vanishingly small. If we send a ship to another star, if we actually arrive at a planet capable of supporting life, the possibility of encountering something living is real, not guaranteed, not even necessarily likely for any specific destination, but real enough that it must be thought about, must be planned for, must be faced, and the psychological implications of that encounter, of arriving at a destination and finding something already there, something alive, something perhaps aware, something that has its own relationship with that world that predates humanity by millions of years, are almost beyond the reach of our current frameworks to process. Every first contact scenario ever imagined by science fiction writers, every diplomatic protocol ever devised for the theoretical possibility of alien encounter, every philosophical framework ever constructed for thinking about what we owe to other forms of life, all of it was built from Earth, built by beings who had never left, built without the actual, visceral, embodied experience of standing on the surface of another world, looking at something that did not evolve alongside us, that carries none of our history, none of our values, none of our instincts about what matters and what doesn't, and having to decide in real time, with no backup and no guidance from anyone who has done this before, what to do next. That decision, that moment, would be the most consequential in human history, more consequential than any war, any treaty, any scientific discovery. because what we do in that moment would say more about who we truly are, not who we aspire to be, not who we tell ourselves we are in the comfortable safety of our home world, but who we actually are when the familiar scaffolding is stripped away than anything else our species has ever done. There is a concept in astrobiology called the contact imperative, the idea that sufficiently advanced civilizations, almost by definition, will eventually encounter each other as they expand through the galaxy. And what makes this concept so philosophically rich is that it implies the universe might be, in some sense, a contact zone, a place where different forms of consciousness and complexity eventually meet, where the long, lonely experiments of biological evolution on isolated worlds finally begin to compare notes. We have no evidence that this has happened yet. The great silence, the Fermi paradox, the observation that a universe as old and as vast as ours ought to be teeming with detectable signs of intelligence, yet we hear nothing, remains one of the deepest unsolved mysteries in science. And every answer that has been proposed, civilizations destroy themselves before they can communicate. Intelligent life is rarer than we think. Others are listening but not broadcasting. The distances are simply too great. Every one of those answers has its own dark implications, but the one answer that gives me the most pause, the one that I keep returning to, is this: what if we are early? What if life, in the grand sweep of cosmic time, is only just beginning to emerge at the scale that makes interstellar communication possible? What if humanity, troubled, brilliant, destructive, creative, deeply confused and deeply beautiful humanity, is among the first civilizations in this part of the galaxy to ask these questions, to build these telescopes, to feel this particular ache toward the stars? If that is true, then the journey is not just exploration, it is not just science. It is the universe becoming aware of itself for perhaps the first time in this corner of space-time. It is consciousness reaching out across the void not to find something that was already there, but to create connection where none existed before. And that image of a small, fragile, improbable species stretching out from its pale blue home toward the incomprehensible dark, not because it is safe or easy or guaranteed to succeed, but because it is what we are. That is the most human thing I can imagine. We have covered an enormous amount of ground in these first 5 parts. We began with the biology, the body's dependence on a world it spent billions of years adapting to. We moved through the psychology, the mind's need for connection, meaning the familiar anchors of identity. We grappled with time, not just the practical timescales of interstellar distance, but the relativistic strangeness of what speed does to the flow of experience itself. And now we've arrived at arrival, the moment the destination becomes real, with all of its alienness and indifference and breathtaking possibility. But here is what we haven't yet confronted. And I want to be honest with you, this next part is where the conversation shifts from challenging to something that I genuinely believe could reshape how you think about what it means to be human. Because everything we've discussed so far assumes one thing, that the humans who make this journey will be, more or less, us. Biologically, neurologically, psychologically recognizable to the people who built the ships and wrote the mission plans and said goodbye at the launch site. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the only version of interstellar travel that actually works, that doesn't break the people inside it beyond recovery, requires us to become something genuinely, deliberately, fundamentally different? If we change enough to survive the journey, if we alter our biology, our neurology, our relationship with time and mortality and identity deeply enough to make the trip sustainable, are we still the same species that decided to go? And does the answer to that question matter? There is a version of you that could survive interstellar travel, not the version sitting here right now, watching this video, not the version that was shaped by billions of years of evolution on a warm, wet, magnetically shielded world with a 24-hour day and a particular quality of golden afternoon light that your nervous system has been calibrated to find comforting since before you were born. Not that version. That version, as we've spent 5 parts establishing, is beautifully, intricately, almost poetically mismatched for the cosmos beyond this solar system. But there is another version, one that could handle the radiation, one whose circadian rhythm isn't anchored to Earth's rotation, one whose bones don't dissolve in low gravity, whose cardiovascular system doesn't restructure itself dangerously in the absence of a gravitational gradient, whose DNA repair mechanisms are robust enough to catch and correct the molecular damage that galactic cosmic rays would otherwise accumulate over years and decades of deep space exposure, one whose psychological architecture includes a relationship with solitude and temporal scale and existential uncertainty that doesn't produce crisis, but produces something closer to equanimity, even wonder. That version of you is not science fiction. It is a scientific project that is already in early and fragmented ways underway. And the closer you look at it, the more it raises questions that are not just scientific or technical, but deeply, urgently, uncomfortably human. Let's start with the biology, because that's where the most concrete work is happening right now. CRISPR-Cas9. If you've been following developments in molecular biology over the last decade, you've heard this name. If you haven't, here is the short version. It is a gene editing technology, originally derived from a bacterial immune defense mechanism that allows scientists to make precise, targeted changes to DNA with a level of accuracy and ease that was essentially unimaginable 20 years ago. Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2020 for their foundational work on this system. Since then, it has moved from laboratory curiosity to clinical application at a pace that has genuinely surprised even its developers. Right now, CRISPR-based therapies are being used or tested for conditions including sickle cell disease, certain forms of blindness caused by genetic mutation, some cancers, and a growing list of other disorders. In 2023, the United States Food and Drug Administration approved the first CRISPR-based treatment for sickle cell disease, a historic milestone and a proof of concept that deliberate, targeted modification of human DNA is not just theoretically possible but medically achievable. But here is where it gets interesting for our purposes. Because the genetic modifications being explored in the context of space medicine are not about treating disease in the conventional sense. They are about expanding the range of environments in which a human body can function, about pushing the boundaries of what the human organism can tolerate, sustain, and ultimately thrive within. Take radiation resistance. On Earth, certain organisms display levels of radiation tolerance that make human biology look almost embarrassingly fragile by comparison. The most famous is Deinococcus radiodurans, a bacterium nicknamed Conan the Bacterium by scientists who study it, which can survive radiation doses roughly 3,000 times higher than what would kill a human being. It does this through an extraordinarily efficient DNA repair system, capable of reassembling a completely shattered genome from hundreds of fragments, quickly and accurately enough to prevent cell death. The genes responsible for this capability have been identified, they have been studied extensively, and researchers, including a team at MIT working on a project called SHIELD, which stands for Synthetic Biology for Human Adaptation to Long-Duration and Deep Space Environments, have begun exploring whether elements of this extraordinary repair machinery could be introduced into human cells to increase radiation tolerance. This is not a finished technology. It is not something you can do today, but it is a real research program funded by NASA, grounded in solid molecular biology, producing peer-reviewed results. The question is no longer purely, is this conceivable? It is, how do we do it safely, and what are the consequences we haven't anticipated yet? And those unanticipated consequences are where the ethical terrain gets genuinely complex, because here is the thing about genetic modification at the level we're discussing. We are not talking about fixing a single broken gene, the kind of precise, targeted correction that underlies current therapeutic applications. We are talking about introducing new functional capabilities into the human genome, about adding biological machinery that evolution never produced in our lineage, about creating human beings who are, at the molecular level, different in ways that go beyond variation, and into something that might reasonably be called a new category. And unlike therapeutic modifications designed to restore a person to a baseline of health, enhancement modifications designed to expand human capability beyond that baseline raise questions that medicine and bioethics have been wrestling with for decades without reaching consensus. Who decides which enhancements are acceptable? Who has access to them? If only some people, or some populations, or some nations are modified for deep space survival, what does that mean for the relationship between the modified and the unmodified? History is not short of examples of what happens when one group of human beings begins to think of themselves as categorically different from another. Those examples are not encouraging, and there is a more personal dimension too. A modified human being, one whose radiation tolerance, gravitational adaptability, and psychological stress response have been deliberately altered at the genetic level, would be different not just in capability but in experience, the way the world feels, the way the body responds to stimuli, the way the mind processes solitude, time, beauty, fear. All of these are downstream of biology. Change the biology deeply enough and you change the experience of being alive. Is the person who emerges from that process still you? Is there a continuity of self that survives genetic enhancement, or does the modification create something that is your descendant more than your continuation? These are not abstract philosophical puzzles. They are questions that will need answers, real, practical, policy-level answers, before any serious program of human enhancement for space travel can proceed. And the answers we choose will say something profound about what we think the purpose of the journey actually is. If the purpose is purely scientific, to gather data, to extend the reach of human knowledge, to understand what is out there, then perhaps the question of whether the modified traveler is still human in some philosophical sense matters less than the question of whether they can survive and function. The mission is the mission, the data is the data. But if the purpose is something larger, if interstellar travel is understood as an expression of something essential about what humanity is, a declaration of our nature as a curious, reaching, boundary-crossing species, then the nature of the traveler matters enormously, because a being that has been so thoroughly redesigned that it no longer shares our biological vulnerabilities, our psychological architecture, our relationship with mortality and time and connection, that being might be extraordinary, might be capable of things we can barely imagine, but it would be carrying our project forward in a way that is continuous with us only in the most abstract genealogical sense. This is not necessarily a tragedy. Evolution has always worked this way, each new form emerging from the previous one, carrying forward some things and leaving others behind. But evolution works blindly, without intention, without the weight of a deliberate choice. What we are discussing is something different, a conscious decision to step beyond the boundaries of what we currently are, made by beings who still know what those boundaries feel like from the inside. That decision, the choice to begin the transformation, might be the most consequential act in human history, more consequential even than the journey itself. But Genetic modification is only one pathway, and in some ways it is not even the most radical one currently being explored, because there is another approach to the problem of human fragility in deep space. One that sidesteps the biological entirely, or rather, that reframes the relationship between biology and identity in a way that is even more philosophically vertiginous than gene editing. It begins with a question. A deceptively simple question that, once you really sit with it, has a way of unsettling everything you thought you knew about what you are. What, exactly, is the essential part of you, your body? Your body replaces most of its cells every few years. The atoms that make up your physical form today are almost entirely different from the atoms that made up your physical form a decade ago. You are not the same matter you were. Yet you are recognizably, continuously you. You remember your childhood, you recognize your face in the mirror, you carry the threads of your experience forward in a way that feels unbroken. Your brain? Closer, perhaps. The brain changes too. Of course, neurons die, connections form and dissolve. The physical structure shifts in response to experience throughout your lifetime. But the pattern of connectivity, the specific architecture of relationships between different regions and systems, seems to be where the sense of continuous self actually lives. Not in any particular neuron or any specific molecule, but in the pattern, the information structure, the dynamic relationship between elements. And if the self is a pattern, if what makes you you is information rather than matter, then a genuinely unsettling possibility opens up. This is the territory of whole brain emulation, or, in the language that has become more common in both scientific and popular discussions, mind uploading. The idea is this: if you could map the complete structure of a human brain, every neuron, every synapse, every weighted connection, every dynamic interaction between systems, with sufficient precision, you could in principle instantiate that pattern in a different substrate. Not in biological neurons, which are fragile and metabolically expensive and radiation vulnerable and require a constant, carefully maintained biochemical environment to function, but in computational hardware, silicon or something more exotic, something designed from the ground up for the demands of deep space, rather than for the warm, wet, gravity-soaked environment of a planetary surface. The resulting entity, if it ran, if it experienced itself as continuous with the biological original, if its thoughts and memories and sense of identity felt unbroken across the transition, would be, by one definition, you, running on different hardware, you, freed from the biological constraints that make interstellar travel so brutally difficult, you potentially able to survive radiation that would destroy organic tissue in hours. You able to function in zero gravity without any of the cardiovascular or skeletal consequences we've discussed. You able to be paused, effectively placed in suspended animation for the duration of a journey and resumed upon arrival without any subjective experience of the intervening time. Now, before you settle into either excitement or horror at that prospect, and both responses are completely understandable, let me be precise about where this technology actually stands today, because the gap between the concept and the reality is still vast. We currently have no technology capable of mapping the human brain at the resolution required for whole brain emulation. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons connected by approximately 100 trillion synaptic connections, each with its own strength and dynamics and chemical specificity. The connectome, the complete map of all these connections, has been partially achieved for extremely simple organisms. The nematode worm Caenorhabditis elegans, with its 302 neurons and roughly 7,000 synaptic connections, had its connectome fully mapped by researchers in 1986. More recently, in 2023, a team at Harvard Medical School published a complete connectome of a tiny section of a fruit fly's brain roughly 50,000 neurons, a landmark achievement, a genuine milestone, and also a reminder of how far we are from mapping the human brain. 50,000 neurons mapped over years of work by teams of scientists using some of the most sophisticated imaging technology available. And that represents a fragment so small that it is not even a rounding error in the full scale of human neural complexity. The computational resources required to simulate a full human brain, even if we had the map, are currently estimated to be beyond anything existing hardware can provide. IBM's estimate, based on simulations of simplified neural models, puts a rough ballpark figure at around 1 exaflop of computing power sustained over time, which is at the outer edge of what the world's most powerful supercomputers can currently achieve for a simplified model, not a full simulation. So whole brain emulation is not imminent. It may not be achievable within this century. It may face fundamental obstacles that current science has not yet fully identified. But the direction of travel in neuroscience, in connectomics, in artificial intelligence, in computational hardware, all of it points toward a future where the gap between concept and capability narrows. And the question of what we do when it closes is not one we can afford to defer until it becomes urgent. Because the ethical questions raised by mind uploading make the ethical questions around genetic modification look straightforward by comparison. If a copy of your mind is instantiated in computational hardware and the biological original continues to exist, which one is you? If the biological original is then destroyed, as might be necessary or practical in the context of a one-way interstellar mission, was that a death? A transformation? A migration? Is the entity that wakes up on the far side of that transition the same person who went in, or a very convincing replica of them, carrying all their memories but lacking the essential continuity that makes personal identity what it is? Philosophers of mind have been wrestling with versions of this question for decades. The teleporter problem, the fission problem, questions about what constitutes personal identity across time and change. There is no consensus. There may never be one, because the question may ultimately be unanswerable in a purely logical sense. It may be the kind of question that resolves differently depending on your deepest assumptions about what consciousness is and what you fundamentally are. But here is what I find most striking about this entire conversation, and I want to say it clearly because I think it is the most important thing this entire video. Every challenge we have discussed, from radiation damage to psychological isolation, from the ship of Theseus problem of generational drift to the vertigo of time dilation, from the alienness of arrival to the ethical labyrinth of human enhancement, every single one of them is, at its core, a question about identity, about what we are, what we must preserve, what we can afford to change, and what we lose when we change it. Interstellar travel does not just challenge the human body, it challenges the human definition. It forces us, as a species, to confront questions about our own nature that we have always been able to defer, because the universe was too big and we were too slow, and the journey was always theoretical. It is becoming less theoretical. Not quickly, not tomorrow, but in the direction of travel, in the labs studying radiation biology, in the telescopes mapping the atmospheres of planets around distant stars, in the neuroscience of consciousness and the engineering of propulsion systems. The journey is beginning, slowly, tentatively, with enormous uncertainty in every direction. And as it begins, the questions it raises about who goes, in what form, with what degree of continuity to the species that decided to send them, are questions we need to start answering now, not because the ships are ready, but because the answers will take longer to develop than the ships will. We have now gone deep into the science and philosophy of what it means to transform a human being for the cosmos. And I want to make sure that in all of this, in the weight of the ethical complexity and the strangeness of the technological possibilities, we don't lose sight of something fundamental. The drive to change ourselves is not new. It is, in fact, one of the most ancient and consistent features of our species. Every tool ever built was an extension of human capability beyond its biological baseline. Every medicine ever developed was a modification of the body's default programming. Every writing system, every piece of recorded music, every building, every institution, all of it is humanity reaching beyond what evolution gave us, using intelligence and intention to reshape our relationship with the universe. In that sense, the genetic modifications and neurological enhancements and computational alternatives to biological existence that we've been discussing are not departures from human nature. They are expressions of it. The most ambitious and consequential expressions our species has ever contemplated, but continuous in spirit, with the first hand that picked up a stone and decided it would work better as a tool. We are, at the deepest level, the species that refuses to accept its own limitations as final, that insists on the next horizon, that looks at the impossible and begins, quietly and persistently, and with absolutely no guarantee of success, to work on it. That is what we are. That is what has always made us extraordinary. And yet, there is something in this particular set of modifications, this particular scale of change, that feels different, feels like it crosses a threshold that the earlier ones did not. Building a telescope is one thing. Rewriting the genome is another. Migrating consciousness into a computational substrate is something else again. And I don't think that feeling of difference is just squishmishness or technophobia or failure of imagination. I think it is a genuine moral signal, a recognition that some changes are reversible and some are not, that some preserve the thread of continuity and some cut it, and that the difference between those two categories matters enormously. The question is not whether to change, the question is how much, and who decides, and whether the beings who emerge from the process would, if they could look back at us across the gap of their transformation, recognize us as their origin, and feel something like gratitude or kinship or love. I genuinely hope the answer is yes. I think it might be, but I hold that hope carefully, aware of how much uncertainty surrounds it. Now we move from the transformation of the travelers to something that I think might be the strangest and most profound territory we've entered yet, because we've been thinking about interstellar travel as a journey, a thing that begins, unfolds and ends, a departure, a transit, an arrival. But there is a way of thinking about it that completely dissolves that structure, a way that makes the journey not a line from here to there, but something more like a permanent condition, a state of being rather than a process of becoming. And when you see it that way, when you understand what it actually means to live and die and be born and grow old in the space between stars, with no planet above or below you and no star close enough to be a sun, the question of what interstellar travel does to humanity shifts completely. It stops being about the challenges of the journey. It starts being about the emergence of something genuinely new, a civilization of the void, a people of the dark, human beings or whatever we become, for whom the natural habitat is not a planetary surface but the interstellar medium itself. What does that look like? What does it feel like? And what does it mean for the definition of home, of origin, of belonging, for a species that built every myth it ever told around the soil beneath its feet? That is where we're going next, and I promise you, it is unlike anything we've discussed so far. If you're still here, you're not the kind of person who settles for easy answers. Don't forget to subscribe and give this video a like. Every day we tackle the questions that actually keep you up at night, and we never come back empty-handed. I want you to think about the word home, not analytically, not as a concept to be examined or a problem to be solved. Just feel it for a moment. Let it land wherever it lands for you, because for most people, That word carries something immediate and physical, a specific place, a specific quality of light, a specific smell that hits you the moment you walk through a particular door, and suddenly you are 6 years old again, and the world is the size of a backyard, and everything important is within walking distance. Home, for almost every human being who has ever lived, is a place, a fixed point, a coordinate in physical space where the accumulated weight of belonging presses down gently and tells you, here, this is where you are from, this is where you make sense. Now I want to ask you something that I think is one of the most quietly radical questions in this entire conversation. What happens to a species when that fixed point disappears? Not temporarily, not in the way of a traveler who leaves and misses home and comes back changed but still recognizably rooted. Permanently, structurally. What happens when an entire population, an entire civilization, grows up in the space between stars, with no planet beneath them, no horizon ahead of them, no gravitational body large enough to be called home within light years in any direction? What happens to the concept of home when there is no place for it to attach to? This is not a hypothetical that belongs purely to the far future. It is a question that follows directly from the logic of interstellar expansion, and specifically from what many mission designers consider the most realistic near-term pathway to the stars. Not the generation ship, not the relativistic sprint, something in between, something that turns the vast, cold, seemingly empty space between solar systems into something that might, over centuries and millennia, become genuinely inhabited. The concept is called an interstellar nomadic civilization, and it begins with an observation that sounds almost mundane until you follow its implications all the way to the end. Space is not empty. This is worth saying carefully, because the popular image of interstellar space, the void between stars, is one of almost perfect emptiness. Cold, dark, featureless, a near vacuum so extreme that it makes the best vacuum we can create on Earth look crowded by comparison. And in terms of density, that image is not wrong. The interstellar medium, the gas and dust that fills the space between stars, averages roughly 1 atom per cubic centimeter. Compare that to the air in the room where you're watching this, which contains roughly 26 million billion molecules per cubic centimeter, and you get a sense of just how sparse that environment is. But sparse is not the same as empty. And the interstellar medium is not the only thing out there. On the fringes of our solar system, in the region called the Oort cloud, a vast, roughly spherical shell of icy bodies extending from roughly 2,000 astronomical units out to perhaps 100,000 astronomical units from the Sun. There are estimated to be trillions of cometary nuclei. Trillions. Icy, rocky bodies ranging in size from small pebbles to objects tens of kilometers across, carrying water ice, organic molecules, carbon compounds, and a range of elements that are, in the right circumstances, useful for sustaining human life and industry. The Oort cloud is so vast that it likely overlaps with the equivalent structures around nearby stars. The Oort cloud of our solar system and the Oort cloud of Proxima Centauri almost certainly intermingle at their outer edges, separated not by the hard boundary of one solar system ending and another beginning, but by a gradual, continuous field of icy bodies stretching across the light years between them. In other words, and this is the insight that changes everything, the space between stars is not a barrier to be crossed. It is a terrain to be inhabited. Freeman Dyson, one of the most imaginative theoretical physicists of the 20th century, a man whose ideas consistently operated at the boundary between rigorous science and breathtaking speculation, proposed something along these lines in the 1970s. He suggested that humanity's path to the stars might not involve building ships fast enough to cross the interstellar void quickly, but instead learning to live in it, to move through it slowly over centuries, hopping from one icy body to the next, mining resources, building habitats, establishing communities, gradually, generation by generation, extending human presence outward from the sun in a way that never required a dramatic leap across empty space, but instead a slow, continuous, inhabited expansion. Dyson imagined communities living in what he called cometary habitats, structures built into or around the icy bodies of the outer solar system and beyond, using the resources of those bodies to sustain life, powered by nuclear energy or by concentrating the faint sunlight available at those distances. Small, self-sufficient, slowly moving through the outer darkness, but alive, human, creating homes in places that look, from Earth's perspective, like the emptiest and most inhospitable reaches of the cosmos. This is not a technology we have today, but the components of it: habitat construction in space, resource extraction from asteroids and comets, closed-loop life support systems, nuclear power for deep space applications, are all areas of active research and development. NASA's Artemis program is developing technology for sustained human presence on the Moon, including resource extraction. The European Space Agency and various private companies are investing heavily in in-space manufacturing and the use of asteroid-derived materials. The Japanese Hayabusa missions, Hayabusa in 2003 and Hayabusa 2 in 2014, successfully collected samples from asteroids and returned them to Earth, proving that we can interact meaningfully with small solar system bodies. The seeds of Dyson's vision are already being planted. They are small seeds, scattered across a vast garden, but they are real. Now follow that logic outward. Follow it across centuries, across millennia, across the kind of timescales that make a cathedral seem like an afternoon project. Imagine communities that have lived in space for so long, in rotating habitats, in cometary structures, in engineered environments that provide gravity through rotation and atmosphere through recycling and light through artificial sources, that the concept of a planetary surface feels to them the way the deep ocean floor feels to us. A real place, an interesting place, a place some people study and some people visit and almost nobody lives, a geological feature, an environment, not home. For these people, and I want to be careful with the word people here, because whether they are biologically identical to us or have undergone some of the modifications we discussed in Part 6 is genuinely unknown. For these people, home is not a place at all in the geographic sense. Home is a community. Home is a set of relationships, a shared culture, a moving point in space that carries its meaning with it the way a snail carries its shell. Home is not where you are. Home is who you are with, and what you believe, and what stories you tell about where you came from and where you are going. And there is something in that, something that might at first sound like a loss, but that I find, on reflection, profoundly liberating, that resonates with something very deep in human experience. Because the people throughout history who have lived most fully with meaning and connection and psychological resilience are not always the ones most rooted to a place. Nomadic cultures, the ones that have moved across landscapes for generations, following seasons and resources and the logic of a living world, have consistently produced some of the richest and most sophisticated human cultures ever recorded. The Mongolian steppe cultures, the Bedouin of the Arabian Peninsula, the indigenous peoples of the Arctic navigating environments that would kill most human beings in hours, with a depth of environmental knowledge and cultural sophistication that took millennia to develop. These cultures did not experience their mobility as rootlessness. They experienced it as mastery, as a form of belonging that was not anchored to a fixed point, but distributed across a landscape, embedded in movement itself. A spacefaring nomadic civilization might, over long enough timescales, develop something equivalent, a belonging distributed across the void, a home that moves. But here is where I want to push the thought further, because I think the most interesting territory is still ahead. What would these people believe? What stories would they tell about the universe, about themselves, about where they came from and what they are for? Because every human culture that has ever existed has built its deepest meanings around its relationship with its environment. The agricultural civilizations of the ancient world built their gods from the rhythms of seasons, the flooding of rivers, the turning of stars that marked planting time and harvest. The maritime cultures of the Pacific built their worldview around the ocean, vast, powerful, navigable, full of meaning and danger and beauty. The Arctic cultures built their cosmology around ice and darkness and the extraordinary abundance hidden beneath apparently barren surfaces. A civilization that grows up in the space between stars would build its meanings from that environment. From the silence and the scale, from the slowness of travel and the completeness of self-sufficiency, from the particular beauty of a sky that is all stars in every direction, undimmed by any atmosphere and undominated by any single sun. From the radical democracy of a cosmos in which no single star is home, because all of them are equally distant, equally available, equally irrelevant to where you are right now. What kind of philosophy emerges from that environment? What kind of art? What kind of science? Because science, for a culture that lives embedded in the interstellar medium, would not be a theoretical exercise but a practical survival tool, constantly refined by the immediate demands of a life lived at the edge of what is possible. I find myself genuinely unable to predict it. And that inability, that recognition that the culture of an interstellar civilization would be genuinely new, not just a projection of current human values onto a different backdrop, but something shaped by an environment so different from anything in our evolutionary history that it would produce ways of being that we cannot fully anticipate from here. I find that one of the most exciting and humbling things about this entire subject, there is a concept in ecology called the niche. Every organism occupies a niche, a specific role in a specific ecosystem, defined by what it eats it, where it lives, how it reproduces, what conditions it requires to survive and thrive. The niche shapes the organism over evolutionary time, and the organism shapes the shish. They co-evolve, each adjusting to the other in a slow, continuous, mutually defining dance. Human beings are unusual among Earth's species in the breadth of our niche. We have expanded into virtually every biome on the planet: deserts, Arctic tundra, tropical rainforests, high-altitude plateaus, coastal regions, island chains. We have adapted to environments that differ from each other as dramatically as any two places on Earth can differ. And in each case, the environment has shaped us, our diets, our social structures, our technology, our worldview, while we have simultaneously shaped it. What happens when the niche is not a biome but an interstellar void? What organism emerges from the long, slow process of adapting to that environment? Not just biologically, but culturally, psychologically, philosophically. What does the human niche look like when it expands to encompass the space between stars? We genuinely do not know, and that unknown is not a frightening gap in our knowledge. It is, I would argue, the most exciting open question our species has ever generated, because the answer, whatever it turns out to be, will be written not in books or papers or equations, but in lives. In the actual lived, embodied experience of human beings, or whatever we become, navigating an environment that no life on Earth has ever encountered. That answer is being written right now, in the smallest possible increments. In the design of spacecraft and space stations, in the psychology studies of long-duration astronauts, in the genomics laboratories looking for radiation-resistant genes, in the neuroscience labs studying the brain's response to isolation and novel environments, in the philosophy departments asking questions about identity and consciousness that have no agreed answers. in the dreams of children who look up at the night sky and feel that particular, inarticulate, deeply human ache toward the stars. Now, I want to bring something into this conversation that we haven't discussed yet, something that operates at a scale even larger than the interstellar, and that reframes the entire journey in a way that I find almost impossibly beautiful. We are made of stardust. This is something Carl Sagan said, something that has been repeated so many times that it risks becoming cliché, but the truth behind it is so extraordinary that I refuse to let it become background noise. Every atom in your body, heavier than hydrogen and helium, was forged in the nuclear furnace of a star that lived and died before our sun was born. The calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, the oxygen you are breathing right now, all of it was synthesized in the cores of massive stars, scattered across space when those stars exploded as supernovae, and eventually incorporated into the molecular cloud that collapsed to form our solar system 4.6 billion years ago. You are, in the most literal and precise scientific sense, a way the universe has organized some of its own matter into something capable of looking back at itself and asking questions. When you feel awe at the night sky, the universe is feeling awe at itself through you. When you wonder about distant stars, stardust is wondering about stardust. When you ache toward the cosmos, matter that was forged in ancient stellar cores is reaching back toward the kind of environment that made it. And here is what that framing does to the conversation about interstellar travel. If we are made of the cosmos, if we are not visitors to the universe but expressions of it, local organizations of the same matter and energy that constitute everything from quasars to quarks, then the journey to the stars is not a departure from home, it is a return, a homecoming of sorts, though to a home so vast and so wild that it can barely recognize us as its own. The atoms in your body have already been to the stars. They formed there. They were scattered across light years of space. They spent millions of years drifting in molecular clouds before gravity pulled them into our solar system, into our planet, into the chemistry of life, into the biology that produced you. You are the latest chapter in a story that began in the hearts of stars billions of years before Earth existed. Sending human beings back into that environment, back out into the interstellar medium from which we are ultimately made, is in this sense not an act of conquest or colonization or escape. It is a form of remembering, a way of reconnecting with the deepest, oldest layer of what we are, and the terror of it, the genuine, well-founded, scientifically grounded terror that we've spent 7 parts carefully documenting, is not separate from the beauty. It is inseparable from it. The same scale that makes the journey terrifying makes it meaningful. The same indifference of the cosmos that could break a human mind is also the quality that makes the cosmos honest, real, unmediated by the comfortable stories we tell ourselves about being special, being central, being the point of it all. We are not the point. We are participants. And that is so much more interesting. There is a researcher, an astrobiologist named Sarah Walker, working at Arizona State University, whose ideas I find genuinely transformative in the context of this conversation. Walker has proposed a framework she calls assembly theory, which attempts to define life and complexity, not in terms of chemistry alone, but in terms of the amount of causal history embedded in a physical object. The idea, stated simply, is that complex structures that could only exist because of a long chain of causally connected prior events, carry within them a record of everything that led to their existence. A crystal is complex, but it can form spontaneously from simple physical processes. A living cell is unimaginably more complex, and every feature of its complexity is the product of billions of years of evolution, selection, death, survival, mutation, adaptation. It carries its history within it in a way the crystal does not, By this measure, a human being is the most information-rich object we have ever encountered in the universe. Every cell, every synapse, every memory, every fear, every dream, all of it is the accumulated record of 4 billion years of life on Earth, of millions of species living and dying and passing their solutions forward, of billions of individual organisms navigating billions of individual environments and leaving in their descendants the traces of what worked. You are, in Walker's framework, an extraordinarily dense concentration of cosmic history, a library written in biology rather than words. And when you move through the universe, when you carry yourself, your memories, your fears, your sense of wonder, your ache toward the stars, you carry all of that history with you into environments that have never encountered it before. That is what interstellar travel actually is. When you strip away the engineering and the timescales and the biology and the psychology and see it at its most fundamental level, it is the universe's history, 4 billion years of it, written in life on one small planet, meeting the universe's present, a library walking into the wild, memory encountering the new, the past reaching toward the future across distances that should, by any reasonable measure, be uncrossable, and the terror of it, yes, the genuine terror, which is real and well-founded, and which we have not minimized or dismissed in any of these 7 parts, is simply the price of admission to the most extraordinary story ever told. The story of matter becoming aware of itself, of stardust deciding, against all odds, to go home, but home is not yet in sight. We are still in the middle of the journey, and in part 8, we are going to confront something that we have been circling around for 7 parts without quite looking at directly, because everything we've discussed, the biology, the psychology, the time dilation, the alienness of arrival, the transformation of the travelers, the emergence of nomadic civilizations, the deep time perspective of a species finding its place in the cosmos. All of it has assumed one thing that is worth examining very carefully. It has assumed that we want to go, that the drive toward the stars is universal, or at least widespread enough to sustain the civilizational commitment that interstellar travel would require, that the ache toward the cosmos is something humanity shares broadly enough to make the sacrifice, the enormous multi-generational, civilization-scale sacrifice worth making. But what if it isn't? What if the drive toward the stars is not a universal human impulse, but a particular cultural one, the product of a specific tradition, a specific set of values, a specific way of relating to the unknown that is not shared by all of humanity, and that might, under the pressures of the journey itself, fragment and dissolve long before the destination is reached? What if the hardest part of interstellar travel is not the physics, or the biology, or the psychology, or even the philosophy, but the politics? The question of whether a species as divided, as self-interested, as prone to short-term thinking and factional conflict as Homo sapiens can sustain a project that demands cooperation on timescales that exceed the lifespan of any individual, any government, any civilization as currently constituted. That is the question waiting, and I think it might be the most human question of all. Let me tell you about a project that began in 1972 and is still running today. It is not a space mission, exactly, though it involves spacecraft. It is not a scientific experiment, exactly, though it has produced invaluable data. It is something harder to categorize, something that sits at the intersection of engineering and philosophy and politics and hope, something that, when you look at it clearly, is one of the most audacious long-term commitments our species has ever actually followed through on. The project is the Voyager program. 2 spacecraft, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, launched within weeks of each other in 1977, initially designed to take advantage of a rare planetary alignment that occurs only once every 175 years, allowing a single spacecraft to visit all 4 outer planets of our solar system using gravitational assists, rather than carrying enough fuel to reach each one independently. The primary mission lasted roughly 12 years. It produced some of the most iconic images in the history of science: the volcanic eruptions of Io, the rings of Saturn in breathtaking detail, the blue crescent of Neptune seen from a perspective no human eye had ever previously occupied. And then the primary mission ended, and the spacecraft kept going. Both Voyagers are still operational today, nearly 50 years after launch. Voyager 1 crossed into interstellar space, beyond the heliosphere, into the region where the Sun's influence gives way to the broader interstellar medium in 2012, becoming the first human-made object to reach that threshold. As of right now, it is roughly 23 billion kilometers from the Sun, moving at roughly 61,000 kilometers per hour, and still sending back data that scientists are actively publishing research on. A team of engineers at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, some of whom were not yet born when the spacecraft launched, spend their working lives communicating with machines that are so far away that a signal takes more than 22 hours to reach them one way. They troubleshoot problems on hardware that was designed before the personal computer existed, using software written in a programming language that almost nobody uses anymore, drawing on documentation that in some cases exists only on physical paper in filing cabinets because the engineers who wrote the original code are long retired or gone. And they do it every day because the mission continues, and the commitment made in 1977 has been honored across half a century and multiple generations of scientists, engineers, administrators, and funding bodies. That is a story about what human beings are capable of when long-term commitment is institutionalized, when it is written into structures and systems and cultures that outlast any individual's involvement. When the purpose is clear enough and compelling enough and practically embedded enough in the ongoing life of an institution that it survives the inevitable turnover of the people who carry it. Now scale that commitment by several orders of magnitude, not 50 years, not 100, centuries, millennia, not a team of a few hundred engineers at a single laboratory, a civilization, multiple nations, multiple cultures, multiple political systems, multiple generations of human beings who will never see the mission depart, who will never see it arrive, who will spend their working lives contributing to something whose outcome is so far in the future that it belongs, in every practical sense, to a different era of human history. Can we do that? And I want to be honest with you, genuinely, uncomfortably honest, about why I think this is harder than anything else we've discussed. Harder than the radiation, harder than the time dilation, harder than the philosophical puzzles of identity and transformation, because at least those problems are, in principle, solvable. They have physical or biological or psychological dimensions that science and engineering and medicine can work on. They respond to intelligence and effort and creativity applied over time. The political problem, the question of whether human civilization can sustain the kind of long-term cooperative commitment that interstellar travel demands, does not obviously respond to intelligence and effort in the same way, because it is not a technical problem. It is a problem of human nature, and human nature has a track record on long-term cooperation that is, to put it generously, mixed. Let us look at that track record honestly. The longest continuously operating political institutions in human history are a handful of religious organizations and a small number of universities, some of which are approaching 1,000 years old. Oxford University was founded in the 11th century. The Catholic Church has maintained institutional continuity in some form for roughly 2,000 years. A handful of Japanese businesses claim to have been in continuous operation for over 1,000 years. These are remarkable achievements of institutional longevity, and they share certain features worth noting. They are built around purposes that transcend any individual or generation. They have robust mechanisms for transmitting their core values and practices across time, and they have adapted, sometimes dramatically, to changing circumstances while maintaining enough continuity to remain recognizably themselves. But even the most enduring human institutions have faced periods of crisis, fragmentation, corruption, internal conflict, and near dissolution. The history of the Catholic Church includes schisms, reform movements, periods of profound institutional dysfunction, and centuries of violent conflict with other Christian traditions and with secular political powers. Oxford has survived wars, plagues, political revolutions, and periods of near irrelevance. Japanese family businesses have weathered invasions, occupations, economic catastrophes, and cultural upheavals that transformed almost everything around them. Survival for human institutions is not passive. It is an active, continuous, costly achievement. It requires constant renewal of purpose, constant negotiation between tradition and adaptation, constant investment in the mechanisms that transmit values and practices across generational transitions. Now ask, what institution existing today could credibly commit to sustaining a single specific project with specific technical objectives, specific resource requirements, and specific operational demands across 500 years? Across 1,000? The honest answer is probably none. Not as currently constituted. This is not a counsel of despair. It is an observation that the kind of institutional architecture required to sustain an interstellar program does not currently exist, and building it would be one of the most important civilizational projects we could undertake, independent of whether it ever actually launches a ship. Because the political and institutional challenges of interstellar travel are, in a deep sense, the same challenges that threaten our civilization's long-term survival on Earth. The difficulty of thinking beyond electoral cycles, the tendency of democracies to discount future costs in favor of present benefits, the fragility of international cooperation under geopolitical pressure, the way short-term crises consistently crowd out long-term investments, the challenge of maintaining institutional memory and purpose across leadership transitions, the problem of keeping a diverse coalition of stakeholders aligned around a common goal when the goal is so far in the future that none of the current stakeholders will live to see its completion. These are not just problems for interstellar mission planners, they are the defining political challenges of our era. Climate change, pandemic preparedness, nuclear risk reduction, biodiversity preservation. All of these require exactly the kind of long-term, cooperative, beyond individual lifetimes thinking that interstellar travel demands. They are practice problems for the same cognitive and institutional muscles. And we are, it must be said, not performing brilliantly on them. But here is where I want to push back against the pessimism because I think it is incomplete. We are also, simultaneously, doing things that would have seemed politically impossible a generation ago. The International Space Station, a permanently crewed research facility in low Earth orbit, built and operated through a consortium of 15 nations, including the United States and Russia, countries that were bitter adversaries for much of the 20th century, has been continuously inhabited since the 2nd of November 2000. More than 20 years of uninterrupted human presence in space, sustained through political transitions, international crises, and the deaths of several of the astronauts and cosmonauts who contributed to it. That is not nothing. That is a genuine proof of concept for international long-term cooperation in space. The James Webb Space Telescope, the most powerful space telescope ever built, capable of observing the atmospheres of exoplanets and the first galaxies formed after the Big Bang, is a collaboration between NASA, the European Space Agency, and the Canadian Space Agency. It took decades to design, build, and launch. It survived multiple budget crises, technical setbacks, a global pandemic, and a launch delay of 14 years from its original target date. And when it finally reached its operational position at the second Lagrange point, roughly 1.5 million kilometers from Earth in 2022, and sent back its first images of a depth and clarity that reduced grown scientists to tears, it demonstrated what patient, sustained, multinational commitment to a long-term scientific objective can actually produce. These are not triumphs of political idealism. They are messy, complicated, sometimes barely functional achievements of political realism. People and institutions finding ways to cooperate despite their differences because the goal was compelling enough and the mechanisms were robust enough to survive the inevitable friction. The question for interstellar travel is whether that same pattern, messy, imperfect, constantly renegotiated cooperation, can be sustained at a scale and across a time frame that dwarfs anything we have previously attempted. And here I want to introduce a concept that I think is genuinely underappreciated in these discussions: the role of narrative, of story, of the shared mythologies that hold civilizations together across time. Every long-lasting human institution is held together not just by rules and incentives and organizational structures, though all of those matter, but by a story. A story about who the institution is, what it stands for, where it came from, and where it is going. The story is what gives the rules meaning. The story is what makes the sacrifices feel worth making. The story is what gets transmitted across generations when everything else is changing: the technology, the personnel, the political context, the specific details of what the institution actually does on any given day. An interstellar civilization, or an Earth-based civilization committed to launching one, would need a story powerful enough to survive centuries, not a propaganda slogan, not a mission statement crafted by a committee, a genuine, living myth, something that people could find themselves inside of, something that made the sacrifice of a life spent contributing to a project whose completion they would never witness feel meaningful rather than futile. We actually have candidates for this story. We have had them for a long time. The story of our cosmic origin, of matter organized by physics and chemistry and biology into beings capable of awareness, reaching back toward the stars that made their atoms. That is a story, a true one grounded in the best science we have, one that connects every human being across every culture and every era to the same origin point, the story of exploration as a defining human impulse, the idea that we are, at our core, a species that moves toward the unknown, that cannot help but ask what is over the next horizon. That is a story, one visible in the archaeological record of human migration across the entire planet, in the oral traditions of countless cultures, in the literature and music and art that every civilization has produced about the journey and the destination and what is found there. The story of continuity across generations, the idea that we are not just individuals but links in a chain that stretches from our ancestors to our descendants, and that the choices we make ripple forward through time in ways we will never fully witness, but that matter nonetheless. That is a story. One visible in every tradition of ancestor veneration, in every act of planting a tree for the next generation, in every parent who sacrifices for a child's future. These stories are already present in human culture. They do not need to be invented from scratch. They need to be recognized, articulated, and woven together into a narrative compelling enough to sustain a civilizational commitment across the timescales we're discussing. But there is a political dimension to interstellar travel that goes beyond institutional longevity and narrative coherence, one that is, in some ways, even more fundamental. And it is a question that tends to get asked in hushed tones in academic conferences and then nervously set aside because it has no comfortable answer. Who goes? This is not a logistical question about crew selection criteria, though it is that too. It is a question about power and justice and what the expansion of our species into the cosmos says about the values we carry with us when we go. The history of human expansion on Earth is not a story of equitable distribution of opportunity. The peoples who have historically controlled the technology and resources that enabled long-distance travel, the ships, the navigational instruments, the capital to fund expeditions, have used that control to establish relationships with those who lacked it that were, to put it with enormous understatement, not characterized by equality. Colonization, extraction, the deliberate erasure of cultures, languages, knowledge systems that took thousands of years to develop, the physical displacement and destruction of populations, the systematic subordination of entire peoples to the economic and political interests of those with superior technology. These are not distant historical footnotes. They are the living context within which any conversation about human expansion into space, as on Earth, has to take place. And anyone who engages seriously with the prospect of interstellar travel while ignoring that context is not doing serious thinking. They are doing wishful thinking dressed in the language of science. The question of who goes, who decides, who benefits, who bears the costs, whose values and cultures and ways of knowing are represented in the civilization that eventually reaches another star, is not a question that can be answered after the ships are built. It shapes what gets built, how it gets built, and what arrives at the destination. A civilization that launches into the cosmos, carrying the values and power structures of 20th and 21st century Earth. The inequalities, the extractive logic, the tendency to treat some human lives as more valuable than others, will produce a very different, interstellar future than one that takes the opportunity of this extraordinary project to build something better. This is where the conversation about interstellar travel connects unexpectedly and I think profoundly to some of the most urgent questions of our current moment. Questions about how we organize our societies, about who has access to the technologies that are reshaping the future, about whether the extraordinary resources required for a civilizational project of this scale are mobilized in ways that lift human well-being broadly or concentrate power and opportunity in the hands of those who already have the most. These are political questions, economic questions, questions of justice and ethics and the values we actually hold rather than the ones we claim to hold. And they are interstellar questions because the civilization that eventually, if ever, builds a ship capable of reaching another star will be built on the foundations we are laying right now. Every investment in education that expands the pool of human minds engaged with these problems, every act of international cooperation that builds the institutional muscles for sustained global collaboration, every step toward a more equitable distribution of the benefits of science and technology, every conversation that takes seriously the perspectives of communities whose voices have historically been excluded from the rooms where these decisions get made, all of it matters. All of it is, in the longest view, preparation, and there is one more political dimension I want to raise before we move on. One that is speculative but I think genuinely important. What happens to Earth, to the civilization left behind, when the ships depart? This might seem like a secondary question, a concern for those staying rather than those going. But I think it is actually central to the ethics of the whole enterprise, because any interstellar mission of the scale we've been discussing would require an enormous concentration of resources, human talent, technological capability, industrial capacity, economic investment over a very long period of time. Resources that could, in principle, be directed toward other things, toward addressing poverty, toward treating disease, toward restoring damaged ecosystems, toward building the social and educational infrastructure that would allow more human beings to live lives of meaning and dignity. This is not an argument against interstellar travel. It is an argument that the decision to pursue it cannot be made in isolation from questions about what else those resources could do, and who gets to make that trade-off, and on whose behalf. It is also, I think, a false dichotomy, presented more often by people who want to shut down the conversation than by people thinking carefully about it. The history of transformative technologies consistently shows that the development and deployment of ambitious, frontier technologies tends to generate capability, knowledge, and economic activity that benefits far more than just the immediate goal. The space programs of the 20th century produced satellite communications, weather forecasting, GPS navigation, advances in computing, materials science, medical imaging, and 100 other technologies that have transformed daily life for billions of people who never thought about orbital mechanics in their lives. An interstellar program, pursued seriously, transparently, with broad international participation and genuine commitment to distributing its benefits, could do the same at a civilizational scale. The challenge is ensuring that it is pursued that way, that the excitement of the goal does not become a justification for concentrating power and bypassing accountability, that the story of humanity reaching for the stars does not become, once again, a story where some humans do the reaching and others provide the platform they stand on without being acknowledged or compensated or included. We are approaching the end of this journey, not the interstellar one, which remains very much in the realm of the distant and the theoretical, but this particular journey through the most profound questions that interstellar travel raises. And as we approach that end, I want to name something that has been present throughout every part of this conversation without being explicitly stated. Every challenge we have examined, the biological, the psychological, the temporal, the philosophical, the political, has revealed something about what we are right now, about the specific, particular, situated nature of human existence at this moment in cosmic history, about the ways our bodies and minds and cultures and institutions are exquisitely adapted to a very specific set of conditions, and about what happens when those conditions begin to give way. And every one of those revelations, however uncomfortable, has also been a form of self-knowledge, a deeper understanding of what we are, of what we value, of what we cannot afford to lose and what we might, carefully, intentionally, with full awareness of what it costs, be willing to change. That self-knowledge is not separate from the journey. It is the journey, the real journey, the one that is already underway in every laboratory and observatory and philosophy department and ethics committee and spacecraft mission control that is engaging seriously with these questions right now. We are already on our way. We just haven't left yet. There is a photograph taken on the 14th of February 1990 that I want you to hold in your mind for a moment. It was taken by Voyager 1, the same spacecraft we talked about in Part 8, from a distance of roughly 6 billion kilometers from Earth. At the request of Carl Sagan, mission controllers commanded the spacecraft to turn its camera back toward the inner solar system one final time before the cameras were shut down permanently to conserve power for the long journey ahead. What the camera captured in that image is almost impossible to describe in a way that does justice to what it actually means. Earth appears as a single pixel, a pale blue dot, as Sagan famously called it, suspended in a beam of scattered sunlight surrounded by the absolute darkness of interplanetary space. No features are visible, no continents, no oceans, no cities, no faces. Just a point of light so small and so faint that if you didn't know what you were looking at, you might not notice it at all. Sagan wrote about that image in a passage that I believe is one of the most important things any human being has ever put into words. He said, "Look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam." He then made an argument, not a sentimental one, but a rigorously logical one, that this perspective, this view of Earth from the outside, is one of the most morally important things a human being can experience, because it makes visible, in a way that no amount of reasoning can quite achieve, how fragile and precious and utterly non-negotiable our shared home actually is, and how absurd his word, and he meant it with the full weight of absurdity, the divisions and conflicts and cruelties we inflict on each other look from a sufficient distance. That photograph was not taken by an interstellar spacecraft. Voyager 1, for all its extraordinary journey, is still, even today, after nearly 50 years of travel, within the outermost fringes of our own solar system. The nearest star, Proxima Centauri, is still roughly 70,000 times further away than Voyager 1 has traveled. But the perspective it offered, the cognitive and emotional shift that comes from seeing Earth as a point of light rather than as a world, is a preview of something, a small taste of what interstellar distance would amplify enormously, because from the distance of even the nearest star, Earth would not be visible at all. It would be lost in the glare of the sun, undetectable by any instrument we currently possess, invisible even to a telescope of extraordinary power. From another star, we do not exist as an observable feature of the universe. We are hidden, implied by the subtle wobble of our sun's motion, perhaps detectable in the faint, periodic dimming of sunlight as our planet crosses the stellar disk, but not seen, not visible, not present in any way that an observer at that distance could point to directly and say, "There, what does it do to you to sit with that? To really let it in?" I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this reflection that goes wrong, a version that takes the smallness of Earth, the brevity of human history against the timescale of the cosmos, the invisibility of our civilization from any interstellar vantage point, and uses those facts to arrive at nihilism, at the conclusion that nothing matters, that all human effort is meaningless, that the scale of the universe renders our lives irrelevant. That conclusion is, I would argue, a misreading of the evidence, a logical error, and it is worth understanding exactly why, because getting this right is not just philosophically important, it is, I think, practically essential for the kind of long-term thinking that interstellar travel demands. The universe is vast, incomprehensibly vast, 14 billion years old, 93 billion light-years across in the observable portion alone, home to an estimated 2 trillion galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars, each of those stars potentially orbited by planets, some of which may harbor life, some of that life may produce minds, and some of those minds may, across the incomprehensible span of deep time, develop the capacity to ask questions about their own existence and their place in the cosmos. And in all of that staggering, almost incomprehensible immensity, the fact that here, on this particular planet, around this particular star, in this particular corner of this particular galaxy, Matter organized itself into something capable of caring about the vastness. That is not a small thing. That is extraordinary. That might be, for all we currently know, extraordinarily rare. The significance of consciousness, of the capacity to experience, to wonder, to love, to suffer, to create, to ask questions about the nature of reality, does not scale with physical size. An atom is not more significant than a thought just because it is more fundamental. A galaxy is not more meaningful than a symphony just because it is more massive. Significance is not a property of matter. It is a property of awareness. And awareness, as far as we know, is not distributed uniformly across the cosmos. It is concentrated here, in the thin biological film clinging to the surface of a small planet, in the electrochemical activity of brains that took 4 billion years to develop. You are, in the most literal sense, one of the universe's most concentrated points of significance. Not because you are special in the way a child wants to be special, not because the cosmos has singled you out, arranged itself around you, placed you at the center of a story written for your benefit, but because you experience, because there is something it is like to be you, because the universe in you knows itself imperfectly, partially, through the distorting lens of an evolved nervous system, but knows itself nonetheless. That is remarkable. That is worth protecting. That is worth the terror of the journey. Now, here is the shift I promised you. The one that I said is available right now, without a spacecraft. Every limitation we have explored in this video, every biological fragility, every psychological vulnerability, every temporal distortion, every philosophical puzzle is a limitation that is already present in your life, not at the scale of interstellar travel, not amplified by light years and centuries and the absolute darkness of the void between stars, but present, real, already shaping the experience of being you. Your body is radiation vulnerable right now, not to cosmic rays, but to the ordinary accumulation of molecular damage that we call aging, the slow, continuous, irreversible process by which the machinery of your cells accumulates errors, loses efficiency, eventually fails. You are, in a biological sense, already on a one-way journey through time with a limited supply of the resource you most need, in a body that was not designed for permanence. Your mind is subject to the distortions of isolation and monotony right now. Anyone who has lived through a period of genuine social disconnection, an illness, a loss, a period of enforced solitude, knows what prolonged isolation does to the quality of perception and thought and emotional regulation. The interstellar void amplifies this to an extreme that we have spent considerable time examining, but the underlying vulnerability is not alien. It is yours already. Your sense of time is already unreliable. Not because of relativistic effects. Those are vanishingly small at the speeds you move through your daily life, but because of the subjective distortions that psychology has documented extensively. Time moves differently when you are absorbed in something meaningful versus when you are bored or anxious. Memory compresses some periods and expands others in ways that don't correspond to the actual duration of events. The psychological relationship between subjective experience and objective time is already, in your own life, complicated and nonlinear. The question of identity across transformation, the ship of Theseus problem we examined in the context of generational change aboard a generation ship, is already your question. You are not the same person you were 10 years ago. Your beliefs have changed, your values have shifted, your relationships have evolved, your understanding of the world has deepened in some places and been complicated in others. The thread of continuity that makes you you across that transformation is real. You feel it, you rely on it. It is the foundation of your sense of self. But it is also mysterious, not fully understood, something you navigate by feel rather than by theory. And the confrontation with the smallness and brevity of a single human life against the vast backdrop of cosmic time, That is not something that only interstellar travel forces. That is what every human being encounters, eventually, in the quiet moments when the distraction falls away and the reality of mortality becomes undeniable. We are all, in the end, travelers on a one-way journey through time in fragile vessels, carrying the accumulated weight of everything we love and have loved toward a destination we did not choose and cannot avoid. The reason interstellar travel matters, the reason this video exists, the reason these questions are worth spending this much time with, is not primarily practical. It is not because we are planning to launch a ship next year, or next decade, or even next century. It is because the questions that interstellar travel forces into visibility are questions that already apply to your life, and engaging with them seriously, at the scale of the cosmic, has a way of reorienting the scale at which you engage with them in the personal. When you contemplate what it would mean to live your entire life between the stars, to find meaning and connection and purpose in an environment of radical scarcity and absolute darkness and profound uncertainty, you are, in a very real sense, contemplating what it means to live your life here, in an environment that is, compared to the void, extraordinarily rich and luminous and connected, but that is, compared to what you wish it were, always somewhat short of what you hoped, always somewhat harder than you planned, always somewhat more uncertain than you'd prefer. The shift in perspective that interstellar contemplation produces, if you let it in, if you really sit with the scale and the terror and the beauty, is this: it makes the extraordinary ordinariness of Earth visible, not in a way that makes it seem small or trivial, but in a way that makes it seem miraculous. The fact that you can step outside right now and feel the gravity of a planet holding you gently to its surface. The fact that the atmosphere above you, the thin shell of gas that is the only thing between you and the lethal vacuum of space, is maintained in breathable condition by the ongoing activity of billions of living organisms that have been running this system for more than 2 billion years. The fact that a star, a fusion reactor, 139 million kilometers away, provides exactly the right amount of energy to warm this planet without cooking it, and that this has been true, with occasional frightening exceptions, for long enough that life not only survived but complexified into beings capable of noticing and appreciating it. The fact that you can look at another person's face and feel something, that the electrochemical activity of one nervous system can somehow communicate across the gap of two separate subjectivities in a way that produces genuine connection, that love is possible, that beauty is perceivable, that music exists, patterns of pressure waves in air that a brain interprets as something that can move it to tears. None of this is guaranteed by physics. None of it is automatic. All of it is the product of an extraordinary convergence of conditions that across most of the universe and most of cosmic time do not obtain. We live in a pocket of remarkable improbability, and we are so accustomed to it that we mostly don't notice. Interstellar travel, taken seriously, is one of the most powerful tools we have for noticing. There is a practice among some contemplative traditions, Buddhist, Stoic, others, of deliberately meditating on the worst that could happen, not as a form of catastrophizing, but as a form of appreciation. The Stoics called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. The idea is that by vividly imagining the loss of what you value, you reawaken your appreciation for its presence. The thing you take for granted becomes, through the meditation on its absence, something you can see clearly and value genuinely again. Interstellar travel is, in this sense, the grandest possible version of that practice. It asks you to vividly imagine a future in which the extraordinary conditions that support your life, the planet, the atmosphere, the magnetic field, the sun at the right distance, the presence of other human beings within immediate reach, are absent, gone. replaced by void and radiation and silence and the crushing weight of light years. And having imagined that, having really sat with what it would mean to live without these things, you look up from the thought and find yourself on Earth, still here, still breathing air that 1 billion years of photosynthesis made breathable, still held by gravity, still surrounded, however imperfectly, by other human beings navigating the same impossible and extraordinary condition of being alive. And something changes, something quiet and fundamental. The ground beneath your feet is no longer just ground. It is a gift, an improbable, temporary, deeply precious gift. And the people around you, with all their complexity and frustration and beauty and need, are not background to your life. They are the reason the journey is worth making at all. This is what I mean when I say that the most important thing interstellar travel does happens here, on Earth, in the minds and hearts of people who take these questions seriously enough to let them do their work. You do not need to go to the stars to be transformed by the contemplation of what going to the stars means. You only need to look clearly enough, for long enough, with enough honesty about what you see. And when you do, when you really let the scale and the terror and the beauty of the cosmic in, and then look back at your life from that vantage point, what you find, I think, is not insignificance, not despair, not the paralysis that the vastness of the universe can initially seem to demand. What you find is urgency, a quiet, deep, non-anxious urgency. The recognition that the time you have is finite, and the world you have is extraordinary, and the people you love are here right now, and the questions you find most interesting are worth pursuing, and the contribution you are capable of making, however small it looks against the backdrop of galactic time, is real and irreplaceable and yours. No one else will ever occupy exactly the vantage point you occupy. No one else will ever see the cosmos from precisely your position in space and time and experience and understanding. You are, in this narrow and genuine sense, irreplaceable, not precious in the inflated sense, not the center of the universe, not the hero of a story written for your benefit, but specific, particular, contributing something to the universe's ongoing project of knowing itself that nothing and no one else can contribute. That specificity is worth honoring, worth protecting, worth pouring your brief, remarkable existence into with everything you have. And here is the final turn of this particular thought, before we bring the whole journey home in part 10. The species that will eventually, if it does, send a ship to another star will not be the species sitting here right now. It will be built on us, shaped by the choices we make and the institutions we build and the values we transmit and the knowledge we accumulate and the questions we refuse to stop asking. The interstellar civilization of the far future, if it exists, will be the downstream consequence of what we do right now, of the seriousness with which we take the long view, of the degree to which we resist the pressure to optimize for the short term at the expense of the possible. We are, in a very real sense, the ancestors of the people who will make the journey, and the relationship between an ancestor and a descendant is one of the most profound and motivating relationships in human psychology. We do things for our children and our children's children that we would not do for strangers. We make sacrifices for a future we will not live to see, because the connection we feel to those who will inhabit that future is real and powerful and not reducible to any calculation of personal benefit. The civilization that reaches the stars, the one that solves the radiation problem and the propulsion problem and the political problem and the philosophical problem and all the other problems we've examined, will look back at us the way we look back at the first human beings who crossed land bridges into unknown continents, with gratitude, with recognition, with the knowledge that the journey they are on began, in some meaningful sense, with the choices made by people who could barely imagine where it would lead. We are those people, right now, today. And that is not a burden, that is an invitation. The most extraordinary invitation our species has ever received from the cosmos itself. Come further, see more, become something that can survive the journey. We are already answering it, in every telescope pointed at a distant star, in every gene sequenced, and every neuron mapped, and every equation solved, and every child who looks up at the night sky and feels that ache, that beautiful, irresistible, thoroughly human ache toward the light. Let's talk about what is actually happening right now, not the theory, not the philosophy, not the deep time perspective or the cosmic poetry, as real and as important as all of that is, but the concrete, specific, peer-reviewed, laboratory-verified, mission-funded reality of what human beings are doing today to close the gap between where we are and where the stars are. Because I think one of the most dangerous misconceptions about interstellar travel is that it is purely a future problem, something for people who don't yet exist, using technologies that haven't been conceived, funded by civilizations that haven't yet formed. Something so remote from the present that engaging with it seriously is a kind of intellectual indulgence, fascinating perhaps, but disconnected from anything that actually matters right now. That misconception is wrong. And I want to show you exactly why. Start with propulsion, because without solving the speed problem, nothing else matters. A ship traveling at the speeds of our fastest current spacecraft would take roughly 70,000 years to reach Proxima Centauri. That is not a journey, that is a geological event. To make interstellar travel something that happens within a human lifetime, or even within a few generations, we need to go dramatically faster. We need to reach speeds that are a meaningful fraction of the speed of light, ideally somewhere between 1/10 and 1/5 of light speed, which would put the transit time to Proxima Centauri at between 20 and 50 years. That sounds impossible. And with chemical rockets, the technology that has taken human beings to the moon and sent our probes to the edge of the solar system, it genuinely is. Chemical rockets are extraordinarily inefficient at this scale. The energy required to accelerate even a small payload to 1/10 of light speed using chemical propulsion would exceed the total energy output of human civilization over many years by orders of magnitude. But chemical rockets are not the only option, and the alternatives being seriously studied right now are not fringe science. They are peer-reviewed, NASA-funded, university-researched programs that represent the serious edge of current propulsion physics. The most discussed near-term candidate is laser propulsion, specifically the concept developed and championed by physicist Philip Lubin at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which forms the theoretical foundation of the Breakthrough Starshot initiative, announced in 2016 by Yuri Milner, Stephen Hawking, and a coalition of scientists and technologists. The concept is this: instead of carrying fuel, a spacecraft generates thrust by reflecting a beam of laser light off a large, extremely thin sail. Because photons carry momentum, a sufficiently powerful laser directed at a sufficiently large and light sail can accelerate a small payload to a significant fraction of light speed, without the spacecraft needing to carry any propellant at all. The numbers as currently proposed for Breakthrough Starshot are extraordinary. A laser array on the ground, or in space, with a combined power output of roughly 100 gigawatts, focused on a sail roughly 4 meters across, made of a material a few hundred atoms thick, could in principle accelerate a gram-scale spacecraft to approximately 20% of light speed in a matter of minutes. Such a craft, carrying a camera, a sensor package, and a laser communication system, all crammed into something roughly the size and mass of a postage stamp, could reach Proxima Centauri in approximately 20 years. Now, is this achievable? Honestly, and with full respect for the genuine scientific merit of the proposal, It is enormously challenging. The laser array required is roughly 1,000 times more powerful than any laser system currently in existence. The sail material needs to reflect nearly all of the laser energy while absorbing almost none. Otherwise, it would instantly vaporize. The engineering of a functional spacecraft at gram scale, capable of surviving interstellar space and transmitting data back across 4 light-years, pushes the boundaries of miniaturization beyond anything currently demonstrated. But here is the crucial point. None of these challenges violates known physics. Every one of them is, in principle, an engineering problem rather than a fundamental physical barrier. And Philip Lubin's team has been publishing research on laser propulsion systems for over a decade, with results that have been peer-reviewed and taken seriously by the scientific community. Breakthrough Starshot has funded research into the sail materials, the laser array architecture, and the miniaturized spacecraft design. Progress is real if slow. The most optimistic projections suggest a proof-of-concept demonstration, a small laser-propelled craft, accelerated to a fraction of a percent of light speed, might be achievable within 10 to 20 years. A full interstellar mission at the scale currently proposed is more realistically a project for the second half of this century or beyond. But the research is happening now. The physics is being worked out now. The engineering challenges are being identified and addressed now. Beyond laser propulsion, there are other concepts being studied with varying degrees of seriousness and varying distances from practical implementation. Nuclear pulse propulsion, the idea of using a series of controlled nuclear explosions to propel a spacecraft, was actually studied in serious engineering detail in the 1950s and 60s under a program called Project Orion, which involved physicists of the caliber of Freeman Dyson. The concept works in the sense that the physics supports it. A spacecraft propelled by nuclear pulses could potentially reach speeds of a few percent of light speed, which would put a crewed mission to Proxima Centauri within a few centuries, a generation ship timescale rather than a human lifetime timescale, but enormously faster than chemical propulsion. The barriers to nuclear pulse propulsion are primarily political and regulatory rather than physical. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which prohibits nuclear explosions in space, effectively halted serious development of this concept. Whether those barriers could or should be reconsidered in the context of a genuine interstellar program is a question that involves international law, arms control policy, and political will, not just physics. Fusion propulsion, using controlled nuclear fusion rather than fission or explosive pulses, is another candidate. Fusion, the same process that powers the sun, releases energy with an efficiency that dwarfs chemical combustion by a factor of millions. A fusion rocket, if achievable, could potentially reach speeds of a few percent of light speed with manageable fuel masses. The challenge, of course, is that controlled fusion, the kind that generates more energy than it consumes on demand, reliably has been 30 years away for the last 70 years of research. But here too, the picture is changing. The National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California achieved fusion ignition, a reaction that produced more energy than the laser energy delivered to the fuel in December of 2022. A genuine milestone, not yet a power plant, not yet a rocket engine, but proof that the physics works, which is the foundation on which the engineering can be built. Private companies, Commonwealth Fusion Systems, TE Technologies, Helicon Energy, and others, are investing billions of dollars in fusion research with timelines for commercial fusion power that, for the first time in the history of this field, seem to be based on genuine engineering progress rather than optimistic speculation. If commercial fusion power becomes a reality within the next 20 to 30 years, which is now considered a serious possibility rather than a wishful projection, the implications for space propulsion are profound. Now let's talk about the telescopes, because one of the most important developments of the last decade, one that has received less public attention than it deserves in the context of interstellar travel, is the extraordinary improvement in our ability to study planets around other stars. The Kepler Space Telescope, operational from 2009 to 2018, identified over 2,700 confirmed exoplanets and thousands more candidates. It established with statistical certainty that planets are not rare exceptions in the galaxy, but are instead extraordinarily common, the default outcome of star formation rather than a special circumstance. The Transiting Exoplanet Survey satellite, known as TESS, launched in 2018 and is continuing to identify exoplanets around nearby stars, exactly the stars that would be relevant targets for any near-term interstellar mission. And the James Webb Space Telescope, the instrument whose development we discussed in Part 8, the one that took decades and survived crisis after crisis to finally reach space in 2021, is doing something that would have seemed like science fiction as recently as 2015. It is analyzing the atmospheres of planets around other stars, not in vague, uncertain ways, in ways that are beginning to produce real spectroscopic data about the chemical composition of alien atmospheres. In 2023, Webb detected carbon dioxide and water vapor in the atmosphere of an exoplanet. In 2025, teams analyzing Webb data reported the tentative detection of dimethyl sulfide, a molecule that on Earth is produced almost exclusively by living organisms in the atmosphere of a planet called K2-18b, a sub-Neptune world roughly 120 light-years away. The detection is preliminary and contested, as all good science should be until it is robustly confirmed. But it is a real signal produced by a real instrument, analyzed by real scientists, published in a real peer-reviewed journal. We are, right now, in the earliest stages of being able to look at planets around other stars and ask whether the chemistry of their atmospheres is consistent with life. That capability will only improve dramatically over the coming decades. The Habitable Worlds Observatory, a large space telescope concept currently under study by NASA as a priority mission for the coming decades, is specifically designed to directly image Earth-like planets around Sun-like stars and analyze their atmospheric chemistry with enough precision to search for biosignatures. We are, within the lifetime of people watching this video, likely to know whether there are planets orbiting nearby stars with atmospheres that look like they might support life. That knowledge will change the conversation about interstellar travel in ways that are difficult to fully anticipate. A confirmed biosignature on a planet 40 light-years away is a different kind of motivation than a theoretical possibility. It transforms the destination from an abstraction into something almost unbearably concrete. And then there is the biology, the radiation research, the closed-loop life support systems, the psychology of long-duration spaceflight. The International Space Station has, over more than 2 decades of continuous human habitation, produced an irreplaceable dataset on what happens to the human body in the space environment. The one-year missions, Scott Kelly's year in space in 2015 and 2016, compared against his identical twin brother Mark, who remained on Earth, provided extraordinary data on the genetic, physiological, and cognitive effects of extended spaceflight. The results were published in Science magazine in 2019 in a landmark paper with dozens of co-authors spanning virtually every relevant field of biology and medicine. The findings confirmed many of the concerns we discussed in the early parts of this video: changes in gene expression, telomere dynamics, cognitive performance, cardiovascular function, gut microbiome composition, and immune system behavior. But the findings also confirmed that many of these changes are reversible upon return to Earth. The body, given the right conditions, can recover from extended spaceflight to a remarkable degree. Understanding the mechanisms of that recovery and learning how to support or accelerate it is an active and well-funded research program. The planned Gateway Lunar Space Station, a component of NASA's Artemis program designed to orbit the Moon and serve as a staging point for lunar surface missions, will provide additional data on long-duration spaceflight in a deep space environment beyond the protection of Earth's magnetic field. This is crucial because the radiation environment beyond the magnetosphere is significantly more hostile than in low Earth orbit, where the ISS is partially protected. Gateway will tell us things about radiation exposure and its mitigation that the ISS simply cannot. Now I want to bring all of this together, because I promised you, at the end of Part 9, that the final argument of this video would be more specific and more interesting than a simple, yes, we can do it. And I intend to deliver on that promise. Here is what I actually believe. Based on everything we have covered across these 10 parts, interstellar travel, in the sense of a crewed mission from Earth to another star, is not achievable within this century. The propulsion technology is not ready. The biological challenges are not solved. The political and institutional framework for sustaining a multi-generational civilizational commitment does not exist. The philosophical questions about the identity and humanity of heavily modified or digitized travelers are not answered. But interstellar travel, in the sense of an unmanned probe reaching another star system and returning data to Earth, is plausibly achievable within this century. The breakthrough starshot concept, or something like it, could in principle send a gram-scale spacecraft to Proxima Centauri within 20 years of launch. A launch within the second half of this century, roughly between 2050 and 2100, is not a fantasy, it is a stretch goal for serious engineering programs that exist right now. And interstellar travel, in the sense of humanity beginning the genuine, committed, irreversible process of becoming a species that thinks about and plans for and invests in reaching other stars, that has already begun. It began with the first exoplanet confirmation in 1995. It accelerated with Kepler. It deepened with Webb. It is being written right now in the equations on the whiteboards of propulsion physicists and the gel matrices of synthetic biologists and the protocols of long-duration psychology researchers. We are not waiting for interstellar travel to begin. We are already inside its beginning. We just can't always see it from where we stand, because the beginning of something this large doesn't look dramatic. It looks like individual people in individual laboratories doing individual pieces of work that won't add up to something recognizable as a whole for decades or centuries. So here is the question I promised, the one the whole video has been building toward. Do we, this generation, alive right now, watching this, have what it takes to be the kind of ancestors the journey deserves? And I want to answer it not with a rallying cry or an inspirational summary. I want to answer it with something more honest than that, with an observation about what having what it takes actually means in this context. It does not mean solving all the problems. We won't. Most of the problems we've discussed in this video will be solved if they are solved by people who are not yet born. It does not mean launching the ship. We won't do that either. Not in our lifetimes, and probably not in our children's lifetimes. It does not mean having certainty. The honest position across every dimension of this conversation, scientific, technological, political, philosophical, is one of profound uncertainty. We don't know if laser propulsion will work at scale. We don't know if genetic modification will produce radiation-resistant humans. We don't know if consciousness can be uploaded or if doing so would preserve identity. We don't know if humanity can sustain the kind of institutional commitment the journey demands. We don't know if there is anything waiting for us at the destination worth finding. What having what it takes actually means, the specific thing that our generation is uniquely positioned to contribute, is something much simpler and much more demanding than any of the above. It means taking the long view seriously, consistently, against the constant pressure of short-term urgency that dominates the attention of individuals and institutions and governments. It means building the habit of thinking in decades and centuries and millennia, not just quarters and election cycles. It means making decisions in energy policy, in scientific funding, in international cooperation, in education, in the way we treat the planetary systems that sustain us, that reflect an understanding of their long-term consequences, not just their immediate costs and benefits. It means being honest about what we don't know, not retreating into false certainty in either direction, neither the overconfident techno-optimism that says all problems are engineering problems waiting to be solved, nor the paralytic despair that says the challenges are too great and the effort not worth making, but holding the genuine uncertainty clearly and continuing to move forward through it. Because the alternative, stopping, turning inward, abandoning the project of understanding and extending the reach of human awareness, is not actually available to us. It is not who we are. It means caring about the people who will make the journey, not as abstractions, not as hypothetical future humans who will benefit from our decisions the way a budget line benefits from a policy change, but as descendants, as the continuation of something we are part of, as the people who will look back at us across centuries and either find that we were worthy of what they needed from us, or find that we were not, and it means something else, something that might be the most important thing of all. It means not losing the wonder, because the most corrosive force acting against every long-term project of civilizational ambition is not ignorance or poverty or political conflict or technical difficulty, though all of those are real. It is the loss of the sense that the project matters, the slow, grinding, bureaucratic, political, financially pressured erosion of the feeling that what we are reaching toward is genuinely, urgently, irreplaceably worth reaching toward. Wonder is not a luxury. It is not the icing on the cake of scientific progress, a nice-to-have emotional response that adds color to what is really a purely technical enterprise. Wonder is the engine. It is what drives a physicist to spend a career on a problem that won't yield results within the career. It is what keeps an engineer committed to a mission that won't launch in their lifetime. It is what makes a child look up at the sky and decide, with a certainty that no rational argument produced and no rational argument can fully undo, that they want to understand what is out there. Every child who grows up feeling that ache, that particular, specific, thoroughly human ache toward the stars, is a potential contribution to the project. Every person who maintains the capacity to be genuinely moved by the scale and the mystery of the cosmos is carrying something essential forward. Every video like this one, every book, every documentary, every public lecture, every conversation between a parent and a child on a clear night when the Milky Way is visible, is, in its small way, part of the mechanism by which wonder is transmitted across generations. You watching this right now are part of that mechanism. Your attention is part of what keeps the project alive, not in a metaphorical sense. In a real one, we began this video with a question embedded in the title: why interstellar travel gets more terrifying the further you go. We have spent 10 parts answering it: the radiation that accumulates invisibly in the body, the psychology that fractures under the weight of isolation and temporal scale, the time dilation that separates the traveler from everyone they love, the alienness of arrival at a destination so unlike Earth that the very categories we use to make sense of environments fail to apply, the transformation of the travelers themselves through genetic modification or neurological enhancement or computational migration into something continuous with humanity but not identical to it, the emergence of civilizations of the void, cultures formed in the space between stars, for whom home is not a place but a moving point of relationship and meaning, the political impossibility and the absolute necessity of sustaining a civilizational commitment across timescales that exceed any existing institution, the way the journey forces a confrontation with the deepest questions of identity, consciousness, meaning, and what we are actually for. Every layer of distance adds a new layer of terror. Every light year of remove amplifies the fragility of the human organism and the human psyche and the human civilization that would have to sustain the effort. The further you go, the more of what you take for granted is stripped away until what remains is something stripped down to its most essential question. What are we, really, when everything that Earth provided is gone? That is the terror, and it is real. We have not exaggerated it or dramatized it. It is grounded in the best science available, in real research programs, in the data from real missions and real experiments and real human beings who have spent real time in the space environment and come back changed by it. But here is what I hope you also take away from this. The terror is not the whole story. It is not even the most important part of the story. The most important part is this, that we are the kind of creature that looks at that terror and does not turn away, that takes it seriously, examines it carefully, understands it as completely as possible, and then says, with full knowledge of what it costs, we are going anyway, not recklessly, not in denial of the difficulty, but with open eyes and a long-term commitment, and the particular kind of courage that is not the absence of fear, but the decision that the destination is worth the fear. That decision, that quality of orientation toward the unknown, is the most characteristically human thing I know. It is present in the first stone tool, and the first boat, and the first map, and the first telescope, and the first spacecraft, and the first exoplanet spectrum, and every equation being worked on right now in every laboratory engaged with any part of this problem. It is present in you right now, or it wouldn't have kept you here for this long. The stars are not waiting for us. They don't know we exist. They don't care whether we come or stay. They will burn for billions of years, whether or not a single human being ever crosses the void between us and them. But we know they are there, and knowing they are there, and knowing what it would take to reach them, and feeling, in the face of all that knowledge, not despair but something closer to determination. That is everything. That is what makes us remarkable. Not our size or our strength or our speed or our longevity, but this, the refusal to be limited by the size of the gap between what we are and what the universe demands of us, the insistence on closing it, slowly, imperfectly, across centuries and generations, one equation and one experiment, and one brave and foolish and beautiful decision at a time. The journey to the stars is underway. It began long before any of us were born, and it will continue long after all of us are gone. We are one chapter, a short one by cosmic standards. But chapters matter. They are what stories are made of, and this is a story worth being part of. Thank you for watching every part of this. If this video made you feel something, if it changed even slightly the way you see the sky above you, then please subscribe, because there is so much more of the cosmos left to explore together. Every video on this channel is an invitation to take one more step toward understanding the universe we live in. And understanding it, I genuinely believe, is the best thing we can do with the time we have here. The stars are out there, and so are we. And if your mind is still out there in the void right now, then I have the perfect next video for you. Click the one on your screen right now to explore what would actually happen on a journey to Proxima Centauri. We go even deeper. You do not want to miss it.